Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku and Eraserhead were kidnapped for experimentation? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku was chosen for his lack of quirk. Aizawa was chosen for his quirk's usefulness as it pertained to the mission. Both scanned and vetted meticulously, they were followed for a minimum of 1 month, Izuku, and a maximum of 3, Aizawa. It took much longer due to his pro-hero status. Izuku's capture was a simple thing. Not many would notice the disappearance of a quirkless child, let alone miss his presence or go looking for him. Izuku was taken on his way to school on a chilly February morning. His father had disappeared years ago, and his mother made it her life's purpose to ignore Izuku as much as possible while avoiding the notice of Child Protective Services. It took her 2 months to even notice he was gone. No missing persons report was filed. Aizawa's was a much more complicated case. While he didn't have the popularity of an above-ground hero, he was a teacher at UA and well known in the police force. He was a hard worker who never took vacations. The only sick days he's ever taken were when he was in a coma 2 years ago, and that only lasted 4 days. People would notice his absence and would go looking for him. So they staged his death. An artificially made corpse, burnt to a crisp and therefore unrecognizable, was planted at the scene. His capture weapon, fireproof, in tatters around the fake body's neck. A few pulled teeth for DNA and a clean sweep of all nearby security cameras, and Aizawa Shoyuta was declared dead to the world. Taking him to the base proved more difficult than expected. Even with his quirk erased due to the implanted microchip, lodged deep in the flesh of his neck, near his collarbone, he was skilled in combat and non-reliant on his quirk to win a fight. It took 4 men and a mild sedative to get him into his cell. But getting him there was just the beginning. Aizawa groaned as he awoke from a deep sleep, his head pounding and his body aching. Bracing his hands against the ground in an attempt to prop himself up, still trying to force his eyes open, he groggily noted that he wasn't in his apartment. He winced at the thought of another villain encounter gone south, too exhausted to care about having been unconscious in a random alleyway in the middle of the night. Hizashi was going to be said. His palms pressed into the smooth ground. Smooth, flat, like stone. Lacking any roughness, devoid of broken glass or bits of garbage. Shooting upwards, ignoring the screaming of his muscles, Aizawa frantically began searching his surroundings, taking on the best defensive stance he could given his current condition. He assumed that he was in a random side alley of downtown Mizudafu, where he had just been patrolling. His assumption was wrong, and the unfamiliar environment around him was not a welcome sight. He was in a cell of some sorts. Aizawa estimated it was around the size of his classroom, maybe a bit smaller. 4 stone walls surrounded him, a thick metal door on the wall to his right. There were no windows. The only source of light was a dim bulb in the corner of the room, surrounded by a metal cage welded to the ceiling. Squinting in the low light, his headache still making its presence known, Aizawa tried to make out more of his surroundings. The room's furniture was sparse, to say the least. A metal-framed flimsy bunk bed, bolted to the floor, pushed against the far wall, a toilet, also bolted to the floor, and a sink, you guessed it, bolted to the floor. A bar of soap rested pitifully on the ledge of the sink, the only item free of any additional security. And everything smelled like antiseptic? Aizawa cursed silently, leaning heavily against the wall. The fog of unconsciousness was finally starting to dissipate, and things were not looking good. He could think of only 2 reasons why he'd be in a cell like this. Either he was arrested for some reason, unlikely, and this wasn't the Mizudafu police station, he was sure of that, or he had been kidnapped. A quick scan of his person confirmed that all of his personal items, weapons, identification, and communication devices were gone. Great. Even his quirk was gone. Well, not gone, just faded. Suppressed. He could still feel it in his body, the presence of it in his soul, but he couldn't actually access it. The feeling was not one he enjoyed in the slightest. Gritting his teeth, Aizawa took a tentative step forward, stopping when his foot, bare, they took his FNG shoes? Really? Made contact with a small object. A muffled cracking sound, barely audible even in the thick silence, reached his ears. Crouching slowly, his breathing labored, Aizawa struggled to make out what he stepped on. As his eyes adjusted more to the rather horrible lighting, his heart dropped in his chest. "Sheet," Aizawa muttered, hoping that maybe he was mistaken. Something rustled from the corner of the room, around the area of the bunk bed. More specifically, directly from the bunk bed. Aizawa couldn't breathe. His stomach churned, bile forcing its way up his throat. From the bottom bunk of the bed, more rustling and then nothing. But even in the shadows, he could see them, wide, glinting eyes staring back at him, attached to a body covered in swaths of ratty blankets. Upon seeing Aizawa, the figure scrambled backwards, making contact with the stone wall behind them with a muffled thump. It sounded painful, but the stranger made no noise. Aizawa instinctively pressed himself closer to the wall behind him. He swallowed the acid in his mouth, trying to steady himself. He really didn't want it to be true, wanted it to be a trick of the light or his exhaustion playing games with his mind. Aizawa looked back down at what he had stepped on. Prince. Now that his eyes were adjusted to the darkness, he picked out several pieces of paper strewn across the floor, covered in scribbles and drawings. Aizawa looked once again at the figure in front of him, the ache in his chest far outweighing the ache of his body. It was a kid in the bed. A child. Wide green eyes met his across the room. After his initial shock at seeing Aizawa, the child had not moved an inch, just staring at him while clutching the worn blankets securely to his chest. Aizawa saw nothing but pure, unadulterated fear in his gaze. After a deep inhale of breath, because there was a child here, a child, Aizawa slowly raised his hands as calmly as he could, palms facing the trembling figure in front of him. "Hey, kid," he spoke softly, maintaining eye contact and holding as still as possible to not frighten the child. He was never good with kids, that was always Zashi's thing. At the thought of his husband, he had to take another deep breath, forcefully shoving the panic down deep into his chest. He could think about his husband later. The kid was still staring at him, seemingly frozen. He was visibly trembling. Aizawa tried again. "My name's Aizawa Shoyuda, but my hero name is Eraserhead. What's your name?" At that, the kid's eyes widened even more, his mouth squeezing into a tight line. He looked Aizawa up and down silently for a moment, stopping at his raised hands for just a moment. "Eraserhead? The erasure hero?" A quiet voice spoke out, shaking and cracking and absolutely breaking Aizawa's heart because God, he sounded so scared. Taking another breath, he did his best to channel his inner Hisashi. "You know who I am? Geez, kid, most pros don't even know me." Aizawa tried to make his voice lighter, tried to smile, but it came out strained. "Prove it. Your capture weapon, tell me how it works." The kid's voice was still shaking, and the demand was less a demand and more of a question, but Aizawa admired his bravery. It was clear that he knew of Aizawa, which was impressive by itself. He wondered how the kid even ended up here. Or where here was exactly. "Well, my capture weapon is made out of carbon fibers and a special metal alloy. The support department was able to weave my hair into the fabric so only my DNA can activate it. I'm not a quirk specialist, but something about my quirk helps me control the scarf. Honestly, I don't know exactly what." Aizawa fell silent, knowing how half-butted that probably sounded. He never really looked into it. The scarf worked, and that was what mattered to him. He didn't ask too many questions. But he wanted to prove that he was the real Eraserhead, wanted to put the child at ease, if only a little. Before the kid could respond, Aizawa piped up again. "I'm sorry, I don't know more about it. I'm not very scientifically inclined. But I can tell you other things if you want. I'm an underground hero, and I work mainly at night since I'm a teacher during the day. I have 3 cats, Cadaver, BSRD, and Sprinkles. I'd show you my hero license, but it looks like my wallet was taken when I was put here." All while Aizawa was nervously rambling, he didn't know how to talk to kids, sue him. The child in front of him seemed to relax. Suspicion being replaced with excitement, which was not something Aizawa was used to seeing when talking about himself, especially from a child. Said child was now jumping up and down on the bed excitedly, eyes lighting up in a way that absolutely did not make Aizawa's heart melt. "So you really are Eraserhead, Mr. Eraserhead? You're one of my favorite heroes, well, maybe even my favorite." The kid looked down at his hands, launching into a rant about Aizawa's fighting style that was scarily accurate, even including his regional martial arts influences. "And your quirk is so useful in combat. Not that you're not skilled in hand-to-hand, but it's really cool." He took a second to breathe, continuing the moment he got his breath back. "Although when you use it your hair floats. Is that a secondary, latent quirk? Or is your quirk really the interference of the magnetic field surrounding you and others, which would explain the hair floating and your capture weapon control as well as the disturbance in quirks, since most emitter-type quirks rely on the magnetic field to operate?" Aizawa's mouth fell open as he went to respond or try to, at least, but the kid kept talking, unbothered. The longer he went on, the quieter he got, until his words were mumbled and his speech incoherent, speaking a language to himself that only he understood. Aizawa could make out a few words, like goggles and hairband, but not much else. It was clear that the kid hadn't had anyone to talk to like this for a while. Listening as intently as he could, Aizawa shifted on his feet just a touch, his body still recovering from, well, he wasn't quite sure what. At the sound, the boy's excited rant was cut off abruptly, his head snapping upwards. He backed up further into the bunk bed, eyes wide with fear. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Eraserhead. I didn't mean to," he whispered, flinching away from Aizawa as if he had been burned. His shoulders were trembling and tears were forming in his eyes, but none fell down his cheeks. "Whoa, hey kid, it's okay, it's fine, there's nothing to be sorry for, you didn't do anything wrong, I promise." Aizawa managed to get out, trying to overcome his confusion at the sudden shift, slowly starting to move toward the child with his hands still up. His arms were starting to hurt at this point. The kid eyed him approaching, silent sobs racking his small form. Aizawa was completely and utterly out of his element, but he wanted to comfort the kid. He was panicking slightly on the inside because he made him cry and he wasn't even trying to be scary. Can I hug you?" Aizawa asked hesitantly, stopping a short distance before the shaking child, painfully aware of his incompetence when it came to calming children down. The young boy waited a second, once again scanning the pro-hero up and down, looking for something Aizawa couldn't even begin to identify. Ever so slowly he nodded. As carefully as he could, Aizawa gathered the kid in his arms, making sure to give him the space to push him away if he needed to. It was then that the child started crying in earnest. "I'm so sorry, he wept, trying to stifle his hiccups as he clutched onto Aizawa's shoulder. The pro-hero just brought him closer in his arms, one arm holding the boy securely to his chest while the other buried itself in tangled green curls, carding through the child's hair in an attempt to comfort the kid, whispering an abundance of, hey, it's fine, it's okay, you're okay, and I'm right here." The child continued to cry, nestled in the crook of Aizawa's neck and shoulder, grabbing tightly to the man's shirt as if scared that he would leave him. After around 10 minutes of this, the kid's crying started to slow and his breathing began evening out. He had fallen asleep, still curled up in Aizawa's arms. With a sigh, Aizawa slowly and carefully picked the sleeping child up, setting him down gently on the bottom bunk of the bed in front of him, pulling the ratty blankets over his small form. The kid shifted slightly, but didn't wake. Taking a few deep breaths, trying to make sense of everything, Aizawa took a moment to really look at the kid. He had been so concerned with calming him down, he hadn't really been paying attention to the child's features. He had dark bags under his eyes, stark against his pale skin. Greasy, tangled forest green hair framed his face, long enough to touch his shoulders. Tear streaks were glistening on cheeks still round with baby fat and covered in freckles, brows furrowed and face scrunched even in sleep. In the dim light, Aizawa could barely pick out several markings on the child's face and neck, all varying in size and color. Taking a closer look, Aizawa's breath caught in his throat. The kid was covered in scars. Some were white and starburst-shaped, mapping the boy's collarbones and disappearing under his shirt, only to be found again on his exposed arms and hands clutching the blankets. They were obviously older than the rest, at least several months, a year or two at most. His fingers were oddly scarred, markings circling each one at the joints, wrapping entirely around the skin like a warped and twisted ring of scar tissue. The other markings were more recent, the skin still red and raised, not yet done healing. These were thinner, littering pretty much anywhere Aizawa could see. A few were more purple in color, signifying that they were in the early stages of scarring. Not to mention all the bruises. The sight made Aizawa sick. Whoever had taken him had gotten to the kid first, and they had obviously been torturing him for months, maybe even years. His stomach churning and his head spinning, Aizawa returned to the side of the room he woke up in, sitting propped against the wall with both the bed and the door in clear sight. He drew his knees close to his chest, elbows resting on them as he held up his head with his hands. He was exhausted. He was in pain. He couldn't use his quirk, and he had a sneaking suspicion it was related to the painful, immovable lump residing in the area near his collarbone. His gear was gone, as was his communicator and the tracking device his, slightly paranoid, husband always had him wear. He ran his hands quickly through his hair, searching for the razors he kept there on occasion. Yeah, maybe he was a little paranoid too, but they were gone as well. Oddly enough, his wedding ring that hung on a simple leather string around his neck had not been taken. It was a small relief, at least. He couldn't use it as a weapon or anything, but it was comforting nonetheless. Aizawa took a second to think about his current situation. He had been taken hostage by an unknown entity. He didn't have his quirk to work with, no weapons, and no contact with the outside world. He couldn't even remember being taken. The last memory he could recall was walking down an alley after patrol and nothing. On top of all of that, there was another hostage in the mix. A FING child. Aizawa thought about the kid. The young boy was obviously scarred beyond belief, both physically and mentally. He wondered what the green-haired boy had seen here. All of the night spent alone in this cold, bare cell, just waiting for someone to save him. The thought made Aizawa's heart hurt. He knew he needed to save him, he just needed to figure out how. Sighing, Aizawa shook his head. Now wasn't the time to scheme. He didn't have enough information to make a proper plan anyway. With the shape he was in physically, he could barely walk in a straight line, let alone fight his way out of whatever prison he was in. He allowed himself to bury his head in his knees, knowing that he needed to conserve as much energy as possible. As much as he hated it, that meant he needed to sleep. Shoulders slouching and eyelids drooping, Aizawa thought about Hisashi. He'd give anything to be home with him right now, even if it meant listening to his horrible American music. Shra, Britney Spears is an icon and I will not let you slander her like this. Zashi, she sounds like she's trying to impersonate a baby shitting itself. I wouldn't call that iconic. Shoo. He'd listen to Britney Spears all day if it meant he'd get to sleep in a real bed and drink some hot coffee. A smaller part of Aizawa whispered that he missed his husband and his cats, missed the warm embrace that always greeted him even at 3 a.m. after a patrol, missed the obnoxious, adorable, singing that never failed to wake him up in the morning, afternoon. He breathed through the tightness of his chest, silencing that voice in his head. Aizawa was a hero. He couldn't afford to get emotional right now. Besides, he was going to make it home soon enough. He was going to save the kid, hug his husband, and drink as much coffee as he wanted. It was all going to be okay. Everything was going to work out. Right? Izuku woke up slowly, dragging himself reluctantly out of the warm and hazy embrace of sleep and into the harsh and unforgiving world he had grown accustomed to. This time, however, was different. Izuku had a dream last night. An actual dream, not a nightmare like usual. He dreamt that Eraserhead, his favorite hero, had come to save him. Eraserhead was kind and gave him a hug. He was everything that Izuku wished All Might could have been, caring, empathetic, a hero, but he quickly pushed that into the back of his mind. Thinking about All Might and the last time they met only brought up bad memories. It was a good dream. He wished it could have lasted longer. Sitting up in his small bed, Izuku rubbed his eyes tiredly as he glanced over to where he first saw Eraserhead in his dream. He rubbed his eyes again, shaking his head aggressively. He had officially gone crazy. Or he must still be dreaming because Eraserhead was there. The man was sitting propped against the wall with his knees pulled close to his chest, head resting in his arms, seemingly asleep. Scared to move in case it really was a dream, Izuku just looked at the underground hero. He couldn't see his face as it was tucked into his knees, but the man looked smaller than he thought, all curled into himself. His hair, long and dark, lay tangled around his shoulders, a little greasy. Izuku thought about last night. Maybe it was real. Eraserhead's hug was warm, and his eyes were gentle. He wanted it to be real. Every fiber of his being wanted it to be real. He took a deep breath and moved to get out of bed. The second he did, the hero's head snapped upwards, his eyes open and lined with dark bags. Figured. Sleep okay? It wasn't a dream. Izuku was still processing that this was actually happening. Too shocked to speak, he nodded. Carefully, he sat down on the ground in front of Eraser, watching him closely. I still never got your name. I was also hoping you could explain what's going on here. It seems like you've been here for a bit. Izuku cleared his throat, fidgeting with his hands. Eraserhead was his favorite hero, but the man's sharp and searching gaze was intimidating, to say the least. But he was going to try his best to explain what he could. My name is Midoriya Izuku, Mr. Eraserhead, sir. I'd prefer if you called me Izuku, though. A dark look passed over his face, passing quickly. Izuku tried to collect himself. This information was important, especially for Eraserhead. He took a deep breath, fighting off the waver in his voice. That on February 8th, on my way to school, I was kidnapped. They, took me here. As he continued, his voice grew steadier, but he couldn't quite meet Eraserhead's eyes. This is a research facility. From what I've gathered, they're researching the origin of quirks and how to erase them permanently. You and I were targeted specifically. It, makes sense, given your quirk is erasure. Izuku gave Eraserhead a moment to take all of that in, his eyes on his hands, picking at his fingernails. Kid, last time I checked, we were halfway through June. You've been here for 5 months. There were no windows in the room, so Izuku couldn't exactly monitor the passing of each day, but he had tried to keep track of how long he had been here. His calculations were a week off. Although it had felt like years already. I guess so. Eraserhead looked at him with sad eyes. Izuku looked away, and the room fell silent until Eraser spoke next. So they're looking to research quirk erasure. I understand why they would take me, but why you? You're what, 7? 8? Izuku could feel his cheeks flushing. What? No, I'm 10. The second he said it, he realized that it didn't sound much better than being 7 years old. Eraserhead eyed the crayons on the floor, surrounded by scribbled drawings. Following his eyes, Izuku was quick to clarify. They wouldn't give me actual pencils, so they gave me crayons. I, analyzed everything I could and wrote it down in my own code so they wouldn't know what I was writing about, he said, pulling his knees close to his chest. Looking more closely at Izuku's code, Eraserhead raised his eyebrows as if surprised. No one had ever really looked at his code before. Izuku found it incredibly embarrassing that the first person to do so was literally his favorite hero. Okay, so why would they kidnap a 10-year-old? And that was the question, wasn't it? Izuku opened his mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. He could make something up. He could tell Eraserhead that he didn't know why, or that he had a special quirk that did something. He picked at his nails more, trying to figure out what to say, trying to brace himself for Eraserhead's response. He needed to tell the truth, he knew that. But that didn't make the truth any easier to tell. I'm quirkless. I'm the perfect test subject. Eraserhead inhaled sharply through his nose. Izuku was sure that he knew how quirkless people were treated, especially now that over 80% of the world had quirks, 96% in Japan specifically. Underground heroes are the ones answering the most calls about shoes left abandoned on rooftops, after all. But a quirkless child was a rarity nowadays, and not one readily accepted by society. Heroes included. The room was quiet again. Izuku couldn't bring himself to look at Eraserhead. His eyes stung and his throat tightened uncomfortably, but he wasn't going to cry. He wasn't going to. You don't have to talk to me anymore if you don't want to. I get it. I know I'm just a Deku. His voice broke on the insult of a nickname, shoulders shaking as he suppressed the sobs bubbling up in his chest. Useless? People called you useless? Izuku didn't respond, just waited. Waited for Eraserhead to get mad, or to curse at him, or... Whoever said that is a piece of shit. His voice was stern but not mean. It held no room for disputing. Head shooting up, Izuku's face was ruddy, his eyes. This was not what he had expected. Quirks are nothing more than glorified superpowers. They're nice in a fight, but they mean nothing when assessing the character of a person. I don't know you well, but I can tell that you're resilient and smarter than most of my students. No one is useless, regardless of whether or not they have a quirk. Izuku was speechless, to say the least. This man, his favorite hero, hadn't wavered in his kindness when everyone else in his life, even his mother, saw his quirklessness as a disease. Hell, he was diagnosed quirkless. He spoke quietly, his stomach practically flipping in his body. Do you think someone could be a hero without a quirk? Eraserhead paused, clearly considering the question carefully. I don't see why not, he started slowly. Quirks are tools. I practically fight quirkless, since my quirk isn't combat-based. It would take a lot of work and resolve, but yes, you, or someone else, could become a hero without a quirk. It was then that Izuku broke down completely. It felt like his whole world was turning upside down in this cold and dark cell. It was almost comical, given the circumstances. After a few minutes, Izuku managed out a quiet, "thank you," between sniffles. Eraserhead only nodded in acknowledgement, looking just a little bit out of his element. Taking a deep breath, the hero began again. So, what exactly have they been doing here since they took you? He winced a little before trying to rephrase. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be insensitive. No, it's okay, Izuku assured him. They started with some tests. Normal stuff at first. Blood tests, a physical examination, all my measurements and stuff. But then, he trailed off, trying to find the words. Did they experiment on me? His voice cracked, full of emotion and pain. It was one thing to experience it, but to have to tell someone else was just. You don't have to talk about it right now if you don't want to, Izuku. Izuku's head shot up, his eyes wide in surprise. Eraserhead's offer seemed sincere. A warmth bloomed in his chest, and he sat up straighter than before, shaking his head. It's important, you need to know. They started cutting me open, small incisions at first. They wanted to see if my body reacted differently to trauma than a quirked person's body, but they kept going. Izuku's voice shook. His small fists clenching against the blanket around his shoulders, tears returning as he unearthed memories he wished desperately to forget. The man who does it, they call him the doctor. Izuku shuddered. He has a quirk that can return someone's physical body to a previous state as long as he's seen it. At least, that's what I think it is. It's incredibly painful and still leaves scars. He can't use it more than 3 times a day, sometimes less depending on how different the subject is compared to their transformed state. Taking a deep breath, he removed the blanket from his shoulders to show Eraserhead what he was talking about. Izuku knew it wasn't a pretty sight to say the least, so he didn't watch the hero's face as he took in Izuku's appearance. But Izuku wasn't done. He pointed to a large, jagged scar located on his right arm, circling his upper forearm in a band, the same type of scarring seen around his knuckles. Around a month and a half in, the doctor started cutting off limbs. Eraserhead was quiet for a moment, his eyes wide. Why would they do something like that? Well, from what I've gathered, it's for a few reasons. First, they want to compare physical anatomy and reactions between quirkless people and quirked people. Second, they're trying to understand how someone's quirk factor works with their biology. My body is the perfect control since I, don't have a quirk. Third, Izuku paused, taking a shaky breath. They want to see if a person can forcibly gain a quirk, either by emotional trauma or physical. Izuku scrubbed his eyes, puffy and red from crying. He tried to think about anything else he could tell Eraserhead, any information that would be valuable to him. He thought of empty rooms, of tattered clothing, of crying voices, and then of silence. Izuku had theories, ideas of what this place was and what it took to get to this stage of experimentation, but they were just theories. Nothing concrete, nothing that would help Eraserhead. That's what he told himself, at least, if only to stop thinking about it. Hesitantly, Eraserhead stood up, slowly making his way to where Izuku was sitting, making sure to televise his every move. Izuku looked up at him, his brows furrowed. "Mr. Eraserhead? You can call me Aizawa, kid. Or Shoyuda, whatever you're comfortable with." He stopped in front of Izuku, kneeling slightly so he could speak to the boy face to face. "Do." Eraserhead paused. "Do you want a hug?" Izuku's eyes widened, waiting only a second before nodding furiously and practically launching himself into the hero's outstretched arms. And the tears were back. Izuku soaked up every second of the gentle embrace. It was nice. The last time he was hugged like that was just... He couldn't remember the last time he had been hugged like that. Or hugged in general, besides the hero's hug from last night. He buried his face into Eraserhead's. "Aizawa?" Izuku reminded himself, but that felt weird, so he was going to stay Eraserhead in his mind, shirt, chasing the warmth it provided. Running a comforting hand through his hair, Eraserhead sighed softly, whispering to him in a low voice. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Especially alone. But you're not alone now. I'm going to do the best I can to get us both out of here safely." However possible, Izuku hugged his hero even harder. It had been a while since he had been treated been spoken to like he mattered. Choked up to the point of not being able to speak, he simply nodded against Eraserhead's chest. They stayed like that for a while. Izuku obviously needed the physical contact, having been deprived of it for far too long. But by the way that Eraserhead held him, Izuku wondered if maybe, just maybe, the hero had needed the hug too. Before, Izuku was strapped to a table in the doctor's office. Leather bands bound his limbs to the cold metal, a band around his head for good measure. He'd been there for around 30 minutes. After being brought in and subdued, the doctor and his henchmen had left. The initial anxiety and adrenaline had worn off, but Izuku couldn't keep his heart from racing. The smell of antiseptic made him uneasy. Just being in the room made him uneasy. Nothing good had ever come from being in this room. But this time was different. He didn't know why, just that it was. The doctor had been paying more attention to him lately, spending less time in other parts of the facility. Slow, methodical footsteps echoed throughout the office. The doctor was coming. Izuku's heart was racing, pounding against his chest. He wanted to vomit, wanted to scream or cry or do something. The doors swung open, revealing the tall and gangly form of the doctor. His short dark hair was slick with grease, his entire face obscured with a surgical mask and tinted goggles. All in all, a frightening sight made even more daunting by the lab coat hanging loosely around the man's frame, its edges spattered with a rust-colored substance one could only hope was ketchup. It was not ketchup. The man approached Izuku slowly, stopping to pull equipment out of a nearby compartment. Setting various tools on a bedside cart, or chairside in this case, he pulled on a pair of LTX gloves. Now, Izuku couldn't see what the doctor had pulled out. But if the resounding thunk as the tool was placed on the adjacent tray was any indication, it was much heavier than a simple scalpel. Izuku started pulling at the leather straps holding him down, struggling fruitlessly to gain any sort of leeway, anything that would allow him to get out. His labored breathing could be heard in the quiet room, met only with the doctor's bone-chilling laugh. Now, my boy, you know struggling isn't going to help much. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, today we're going to be doing something new." Tears began forming in the corners of Izuku's eyes, his struggling becoming more and more desperate. Please don't, I'll do anything please." Izuku's voice broke with a sob, his body trembling against the cold metal of the chair. He had tried so hard not to cry, had promised himself he wouldn't, but he couldn't contain his fear, his terror at the sight of the man, at the sound of his voice. "My boy," the doctor continued with a sigh, fake pity clear in his tone, "you say you'd do anything, but this would all be over if you'd simply show us the quirk you're hiding from us." I swear I'm no not hiding a quirk I don't have one." Izuku cried out desperately, back arching and body shaking as he tried fervently to escape from the chair, from the doctor, from everything. The doctor sighed again, this time much longer and more annoyed. He moved to pick something up from the side table. That's what you said last time too, my boy. Now if you'd cooperate, we wouldn't have to hurt you. We tried going easy on you in hopes that it would encourage quirk activation, but it seems we were too gentle. Maybe this will help. Izuku heard a click and a high-pitched mechanical whirring sound, almost like a drill. And no, please, PP, please don't. The whirring sound got louder. He could feel the soft wind of the tool against his face, could feel a light pressure on his arm, on his skin. Nothing could have stopped the blood-wrenching scream that was torn out of Izuku's throat. It was pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. He could feel his skin, his muscles being torn apart by whatever tool that was cutting through sinew and flesh, and God, there was so much blood. Izuku's body felt hot and cold and tingly, and like every nerve in his body was on fire, like his arm was being torn off because it was being torn off, he was sure of it. His clothes, his skin, his eyes, his mouth, all staining red as he screamed, voice raw but unable to stop. The pain became more bearable, for just a moment. The doctor had paused, and Izuku gasped in relief. Over, it was finally over. The whirring returned, louder than before. If Izuku were able to think coherently, he would have known why the sudden sensation made his teeth clench and his body spasm, while eating away at his throat and mouth as he choked on his own blood and vomit before his world turned black. He would have identified it as his body shutting down while the bone of his arm was cut into somehow, probably with a bone saw. But it was too much, far too much for his young mind to comprehend, so he screamed and cried and blacked out. After he fell unconscious, the doctor had stopped sawing through Izuku's arm. When he woke up, the work continued. Izuku blacked out 3 more times because of the pain. Each time, the doctor stopped working, choosing to continue when Izuku was conscious. Eventually, Izuku was left with a bloody stump where his right arm once was. Once it was clear that the torture had not activated a hidden quirk, the doctor returned Izuku's body to the state it was in before the procedure, and Izuku had 2 arms again. A scar, and the feeling of unimaginable pain, still remained. It was only a matter of time until Aizawa's first examination. Izuku had warned him, had told him explicitly how things usually went. He explained how the doctor had 3 guards. Izuku literally just called them guard number 1, number 2, and number 3 since he didn't know any of their names. They were all incredibly strong and tall, and that they didn't need to use their quirks to inflict pain. Right before an examination, one of the guards would collect Aizawa from the cell at some random hour of the day, take him to the doctor's office, and then, well, nothing good followed. He did his best to prepare himself for what was to come, running through scenario after scenario in his head, plotting out what he would do in each one. And so, when the cell door creaked open to reveal a man, easily clearing 6 feet 4 inches with biceps bigger than Aizawa's head, guard number 1, he noted vaguely, eyeing the tattoos swirling around the man's arms, Aizawa played nice. He nodded at the kid, ignored the guard's grip digging into his arm, and gracefully allowed himself to be dragged to a room he presumed to be the doctor's office, which he was promptly thrown into, the door shut and locked behind him. The room itself was mostly bare, with the only piece of furniture being a rusty-looking operating table pushed close to the far wall. Aizawa was pointedly ignoring the heavy-duty leather straps at the head, arms, and legs of the table. Next to that was a section of built-in shelves with a little sink, but they were completely empty, as Aizawa was disappointed to find. The whole room smelled of antiseptic, its stark white walls and equally stark tiled floors illuminated brightly by the fluorescent hanging lights. For whatever reason, the ceiling was open, showcasing a variety of wires and pipes. It looked like the room had been repurposed hastily, with the ceiling left untouched. Aizawa looked around carefully. Out of all of the scenarios he imagined, being left alone in an empty room wasn't one of them. An intimidation tactic? Maybe? Or perhaps the doctor was running late for his torture appointment. From his minute of poking around, Aizawa couldn't find anything in the small room he could use as a weapon. The shelves were empty, the table was useless, and the doors were bolted shut from the outside. Aizawa looked to the heavens in frustration. The ceiling was open. The ceiling was open. He didn't know how much time he had left before someone arrived, so Aizawa worked quickly. Scanning the ceiling for anything he could break off, his eyes fell on a thin metal bar loosely attached to one of the fluorescent light strips, probably to keep the whole thing from swaying. It was too high to reach on his own, but after a little maneuvering, jumping off of the operation table and swinging carefully from a nearby support rod, he was able to yank the bar free, only scraping his hands a little bit in the process. Falling to the floor and rolling swiftly, Aizawa hefted the bar in his hands, feeling how heavy it is. It was a little lighter than he'd prefer, no longer than his forearm, but it was a weapon nonetheless, and having it in his possession lifted a weight from his chest that he didn't know he'd been carrying. He missed his scarf so bad. Footsteps echoed outside of the door, the lock shifting. Aizawa quickly tucked the bar beneath his shirt and into his pants, making sure to keep his back away from the door. The door opened, and in walked the doctor, flanked by the same man that had escorted Aizawa in. While the guard immediately stood at attention by the door, the doctor busied himself around the office, carrying a bag on his shoulder filled with God knows, unpacking it near the sink. Aizawa just watched, back against the wall, tucked away across the room. The doctor was smaller than he had expected. While he was tall, he wasn't very muscular. He had no defining features besides the lab coat, goggles, and mask, but his energy was wrong. Aizawa thought about the bar tucked into his waistband, hidden from the two men in front of him, trying to weigh his options. If he attacked now, the doctor would just call for backup, and Aizawa didn't know if he could take all of them, let alone get Izuku out in the process. He didn't know the layout of the facilities, didn't know where the keys to their cell even were. It would be wiser to play it safe, to keep the weapon until he had more information. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Eraserhead," the doctor called out, still messing around with various tools and equipment, not even sparing Aizawa a glance. His voice was annoying, as was everything else about him. Aizawa determined. "You can call me doctor. Do exactly as I say and behave when you are in this office, and you and I will get along just fine." The doctor finally turns to him. He had odd goggles pulled over his eyes and a surgical mask on his mouth, which he pulled down beneath his chin to grin widely at Aizawa. The sight gave Aizawa the chills, disgust bubbling in his stomach. He didn't say anything in return, just glared at the man until he turned back around to fiddle with a syringe? Aizawa wasn't sure. Well, anyways. Enough of the formalities. The doctor looked to his guard. "Get him on the table. Upright. Keep him conscious, and don't mess with his head," he demanded before turning back to his tools. Aizawa's heart raced, trying to figure out what to do. He readied the bar behind his back, hand clenched around the metal. If they put him on that table, the bar would be found. But it was his only weapon. He couldn't lose it. He could attack now and keep it, or wait and have it be taken away. It was risky, incredibly risky, but there were only two of them. He could take the two down, sneak around the place, bust Izuku out, and leave. Or get to a phone somewhere, call for backup. The guard stalked towards Aizawa, getting just close enough. Springing into action, Aizawa slammed the bar against the man's shoulder, throwing him into the wall. He had been aiming for the head, but the guard had dodged out of the way. He was faster than Aizawa had anticipated, already back on his feet and running to subdue Aizawa. The doctor was saying something, but Aizawa was too focused on ducking under the guard's punches, leaping over the operating table to avoid being tackled. Gripping the metal bar as tightly as he could, Aizawa ran at the wall nearest to him, jumping at it before springing off of it, using the leverage to throw himself at the guard, bar swinging at his head. It connected fiercely with his temple, and the man collapsed into a heap on the floor. Breathing harshly, Aizawa scanned the room for the doctor. The man was by the door, watching Aizawa carefully, a walkie-talkie in his hands. Before Aizawa could attack the man, the door was thrown open, with two more guards barreling through, heading straight towards Aizawa. Ducking into a roll under one man's punch, Aizawa sprung to his feet, roundhouse kicking him in the face before narrowly dodging the other guard's attempt at grabbing him. With the other guard still recovering, he targeted the one closest to him, striking out at the side of his knee with the bar, gritting his teeth at the sharp crack that followed. The man screamed, eyes wide and furious, shifting to face Aizawa before pulling a taser out of his belt. The doctor was calling for something that had the unarmed guard running out the door, but his voice was muffled in Aizawa's ears as his heartbeat pounded like a drum in his head. Aizawa ducked under the taser, pulling his arms back to swing at the man's head with all of the strength in his body, bare feet bracing against the ground. The second guard dropped to the floor, unconscious, the taser clattering beside him. Ignoring the blood on the end of the bar, Aizawa whipped around, breathing harshly, eyes locking with the doctor. The man had since acquired a scalpel, holding it tightly with a trembling hand. Aizawa stepped over the guard's body, snarling as he approached the doctor. "Wait a second, I'm sure we can figure things out." Aizawa swung the bar with no hesitation, clipping the side of the doctor's face as he flinched so hard he somehow avoided the brunt of the hit, shrieking like a wounded animal. His goggles flew off his head, his temple now dripping blood. He slashed the scalpel out in Aizawa's direction wildly, his movements clumsy and panicked. Aizawa dodged his attempts easily, jumping back behind the operation table as the door opened again, readying the bar to face another guard. But entirely unprepared when the third guard walked back in, pulling behind him a frightened and confused Izuku. His stomach dropped, blood running cold at the sight of the kid, eyes meeting his and widening in fear. Jumping into action, he leapt over the table in front of him, metal bar clutched tightly in his hands, but he was too late. The doctor yanked Izuku from the third guard's grip, tugging the kid in front of him and pressing him close to his chest. One arm circled around his torso while the other, still holding the scalpel, pressed against Izuku's throat. Aizawa froze, gaze burning with fury as he took in the doctor's current position. The room became very quiet. "Now I do believe it's time to calm down, Eraserhead. We wouldn't want this precious boy." With these words, the doctor tilted Izuku's head up so his throat was fully exposed, the blade wobbling against Izuku's skin, getting hurt. Gritting his teeth so hard he could almost hear them creaking, Aizawa considered his options. The last guard was standing by the door behind the doctor, one hand on his taser and the other on a walkie-talkie. The doctor had Izuku in a tight grip, too far from Aizawa to be hit with one move. And Izuku the kid was trembling, glassy eyes focused on the floor, fists clenched at his sides. Things weren't looking good for them. "Drop the pipe," the doctor demanded, voice injected with the confidence of a man confident that he has won. It made Aizawa twitch, imagining all the ways he could knock the BSRD out. If he could throw the pipe to the side and ambush the doctor while he was distracted, maybe he could get Izuku out unscathed, but that DMN fucker had the kid so close it was nearly impossible. Aizawa's scheming was cut short by the doctor. "I don't think you realize the situation you're in, Eraserhead," I said. The doctor put more pressure on the tip of the scalpel, the blade now cutting into Izuku's skin, eliciting a sound of discomfort from the small boy. Scarlet beads of blood slowly began their journey down Izuku's neck as the man continued, "Drop the pipe." Letting the pipe fall to the floor with a clatter, Aizawa raised both his hands above his head with his palms facing out, painfully similar to how he had met Izuku not long ago. "Let the kid go," Aizawa all but growled, eyes locked onto the scalpel digging into Izuku's throat. It was easier than looking at the kid. He didn't think he could bear to see the fear, the pain in his expression, pain and fear that he had caused, that he had roped a child into. The doctor didn't let Izuku go, much to Aizawa's indignation. Instead, his hold on him tightened. He slowly leaned down until his chin rested on Izuku's shoulder, cheek touching his face. Izuku flinched at the contact, his shaking worsening. The doctor smiled his twisted, ugly smile at the movement. Eyes locked with Aizawa, the man slowly, gradually, turned his head to look at Izuku, chin still propped on his shoulder. Izuku's nose scrunched up in disgust, presumably at the smell of the man's breath. It would be such a shame if something bad happened to such a bright young boy, wouldn't you say, Eraserhead? The doctor faked a tone of innocence, still grinning horribly, eyes boring their way into Izuku's cheek. Aizawa had to bite his tongue to stop himself from ripping the man to pieces with his bare hands. Let him the F go. He could feel his blood burning beneath his skin, his body screaming at him to attack. He knew that if his quirk weren't suppressed, it would be activated, his hair flying and eyes crimson. The only thing stopping him from beating the perverted sicko until he was unrecognizable was the scalpel, now stained red, pressed against Izuku's throat. His poor kid was crying, tears streaming slowly down his throat as he audibly suppressed a sob. "I want you to pick up the syringe on the counter to your left. One with the green liquid in it." The doctor, choosing to ignore Aizawa's demand, drawled out. Aizawa hesitated, but the doctor's patience was wearing thinner by the second. His dark eyes met Aizawa's while his free hand reached up, painfully slow, to gently slide Izuku's cheek. The gesture was met with a flinch, the hitching of Izuku's breath unbearably loud in the quiet room. The doctor's smile only grew, eyes alight in sick enjoyment, still locked onto Aizawa's gaze. Aizawa clenched his fists so hard he drew blood in his rage. But he was a hero, and Izuku needed a hero. He picked up the syringe, trying and failing to stifle his anger. "Now, inject yourself with it." "If you think I'm going to," Aizawa was cut off by the doctor's next motion. Tilting his head slightly, the doctor reached out and with one tortuously slow movement, wiped the streaming tears off of Izuku's cheek. Izuku immediately screwed his eyes shut, entire body freezing as he choked out a sob. Instinctively, Aizawa took a step forward, teeth bared and eyes wild. He was going to rip that man apart. The guard raised his taser, and Aizawa stopped moving. Izuku was crying. He looked so small. The doctor chuckled quietly against Izuku's cheek, moving his gaze leisurely to meet Aizawa's. He liked his lips provokingly, baring his teeth in the process. "I don't recall asking, hero." And didn't that sting? Not as bad as the churning of his stomach, the horror eating away at his intestines, threatening to swallow him whole, but it was enough. His kid was suffering. Taking deep breaths to stop himself from endangering Izuku further, Aizawa shoved his sleeve upwards, positioning the syringe's needle in the crook of his elbow. He looked up, this time at Izuku. The boy's eyes were filled with tears, swimming with fear and shame and disgust and so many other emotions that stole the breath from Aizawa's lungs. He could only nod at him, twitching the corners of his lips up slightly in what he hoped was more of a reassuring gesture than the grimace it felt like, before injecting the unknown serum into his arm. The room was deathly quiet in the moment that passed, before Aizawa's body crumpled to the floor. Immediately, the doctor retracted the scalpel from its place against Izuku's neck, standing upright and shoving Izuku away with an annoyed sigh. Izuku raced to Aizawa's side, grabbing onto his shoulders and cradling his head in his arms after quickly checking his pulse, still steady, thank God. Sobbing freely now, Izuku sat on the cold tiled floor, Aizawa's body pulled close against him. With a broken voice, he cried out for his hero. "Eraser! God, Aizawa, please, be okay, I can't do this why without you please." Distantly he could hear the doctor say something like, "Take them away," but everything was muffled to Izuku. All that mattered to him was the man in front of him, the rising of his chest, the beating of his heart. He was shaking so much it was hard to hold on to Aizawa, but he managed. It was no surprise that he failed to notice the pinprick in the back of his neck, soon giving way to a familiar darkness. His body slumped over Aizawa's, hands still cradling his head loosely. The room was quiet once more. The doctor waited as the line connected, tapping his fingers impatiently against the desk in front of him. As the phone clicked, he began speaking, his words rushed as if he were worried he was going to be hung up on. "Ma'am, yes, hello. Why are you calling me, doctor?" An unknown voice responded, sounding tired. Bored even. Swallowing down his irritation, the doctor continued. "We found a suitable match. Patient 13-9 from Group B. His neural pathways are strangely resilient. I believe he is the key that we've been waiting for, the missing piece. How certain are you of your findings? As I recall, you spouted the same nonsense months ago, and it led nowhere. I refuse to pass this along if it's simply another dead end. I am absolutely certain. I even prolonged experimentation to make sure. If everything goes to plan, his brain, his very DNA, could repave the future of our society as we know it. 19-1A has already been obtained. I need more time with him. He's proving more difficult than anticipated. They've bonded well, as expected. All that's left to do is a deep tissue analysis and… Enough. Don't bore me with the details, save it for tomorrow. If he agrees to visit, that is. Prepare the facilities tonight regardless. You will be contacted with further details. Yes. I look forward to it. The line clicked again, and the phone call ended. The doctor was left staring at his hands, the room silent. Change was coming. He smiled. Change was coming. Izuku awoke from his forced slumber with a start, his head pounding and his heart racing. As his awareness returned to him, spots of black dancing across his vision, he scoured his surroundings frantically. The last thing he could remember was Eraserhead passing out in the doctor's office. The memory had him frozen in place, a sickening weight pressing against his chest. Izuku shook his head frantically, swallowing the bile in his throat. He couldn't think about that right now. He had to focus. Finally able to see clearly, Izuku scanned the unfamiliar room he was in for any sign of the doctor or his bodyguards, any sign of a threat. Oddly enough, he wasn't in his normal cell. In fact, he'd never been taken to this room before. He had been deposited on some kind of cot, a simple mattress, if it could even be called that. It was so thin he could feel the cold of the stone floor through the bed, lying on the ground in the corner of the small room. The room was what Izuku would imagine an actual jail cell to be like. It was very small, about the size of a walk-in closet, with only 3 stone walls. The 4th wall was made entirely of thick metal bars. A section of the bars latched and hinged in what was obviously the cell's entrance. There was a toilet in the opposite corner from the cot, bolted to the ground, no sink accompanying it. Izuku's eyes flitted to the ceiling once he determined that he was, in fact, alone. There were no lights in the small cell, but there was a very small rectangular window in the wall opposite the thick bars. Only an inch or so away from the ceiling, it was barred and locked securely. The sight piqued Izuku's interest immensely. In his almost 5 months in the facility, he hadn't seen a window until now. Standing up, he cautiously peered out through the cracks between the bars into what looked like a hallway. Not seeing or hearing anything or anyone, Izuku carefully maneuvered himself onto the ledge of the toilet, stumbling only once as he regained control of his limbs. Balancing precariously on the metal ledge, he reached upwards to the small windowsill. His fingers scrambled for purchase on the stone, finding a grip that was definitely not enough to support his full body weight. Taking a deep breath, Izuku lifted his right foot to the wall, attempting to push off and up so that he could get a look outside. He struggled to hold his weak grip on the ledge, fingers straining under his weight, but he managed to pull himself up just enough to catch a glimpse of the outside world for the first time in 5 months. His grip faltered and he crashed backwards with a cry of shock, first into the wall and then against the ground. Izuku was in a breath, his left ankle throbbing and his hands, knees, and feet all scraped from the fall. He could barely feel the pain he had seen outside. A mixture of dread and excitement coursed through his body. Even though he only had a quick peek outside the window, he had learned several important things. The facility they were in was massive. Izuku could see several large buildings branching off of the one he was currently being held in, all of them devoid of visible windows and doors. Apart from the connected buildings, there was nothing else in sight. No homes, no businesses, no cars, nothing. Only grass and dirt roads. Any hope of being rescued was useless. Izuku had originally assumed they were hiding in a city somewhere, most likely underground. The chances of a patrolling hero locating him there were much higher than in the middle of nowhere he was currently. The realization that escaping or being found was near impossible was a hard one to stomach. After his first few escape attempts had backfired miserably, he had given up hope for breaking out by himself. But he would often stay awake at night, dreaming of the day he would be rescued, carried away in the arms of a hero with the facility far behind them. The first few weeks of his capture, he liked to imagine which hero would come save him. Maybe Kamui Woods, or MT Lady, or a new hero he'd never heard of before. Months passed, and his hope diminished, but never truly vanished. There was still a spark, still an inkling of optimism that maybe someone was looking for him, maybe the heroes were on their way. But they weren't. Izuku knew that now. Heroes didn't patrol this far out in the countryside. He didn't even know if he was still in Japan at this point. Biting back tears, Izuku slammed his closed fist into the wall on his right, hard enough for it to hurt. It just wasn't fair. He repeated the motion again, and again, until he was sobbing fully, his hand bloody and scraped. His body ached, an empty feeling that never seemed to go away. He looked to his hand, now lying still against his knee. Izuku wasn't going to be saved. But he knew that already, didn't he? He was a quirkless child, even his own family didn't want him. Why would the heroes? His breathing slowed and his eyes fell shut. He wasn't crying anymore. He took a moment to pull himself together. He didn't have the luxury of breaking down right now. Trying as best he could to clean himself up, Izuku scrubbed the tears from his face, attempting to wipe away the now dry blood on his hands and knees. He was about to try and look out the window again, when the sound of approaching footsteps stopped him. A pang of fear hit him like a truck. There wasn't just one set of footsteps. Izuku counted 3 at least, lighter than the guard's heavy stomping. It was hard to make out over the sound of his own breathing, but Izuku could identify one pair as belonging to the doctor, his slow, languid pace giving him away. The other 2 pairs of footsteps were the unfamiliar ones, both approaching at a quick pace. The unease Izuku had been feeling only grew. New people only meant new problems. He looked around the cell, looking for anything he could find to defend himself with, but found nothing. As the group rounded the corner and made their way into the hallway directly in front of Izuku's cell, his assumption was proven correct. The doctor was the first figure Izuku could see approaching the cell's door. Behind him were 2 women, both dressed simply, entirely plain and easily forgettable. Neither of them looked necessarily dangerous or threatening, which was confusing. Both of the women held their hands clasped behind their backs, walking with their heads slightly bowed. It seemed like they were some type of assistants. Izuku was pulled out of his musings when the doctor, now directly in front of the cell's bars, began to speak. "Ah, it looks like you got yourself into a bit of trouble, my boy. No matter, you'll be cleaned up soon enough. We have a very special guest visiting shortly, and you need to be looking your best." The doctor brandished a sly smile as he reached into his pocket for what Izuku guessed to be the key to the cell. His throat had gone dry the moment he saw the man. Memories of their previous encounter still burned into Izuku's mind. His stomach churned restlessly, humiliation and terror eating away at his insides. The doctor unlocked the heavy cell door, swinging it open and making his way towards Izuku. As the door opened, Izuku scrambled back onto his hands, pushing himself as far away from the approaching figure as possible. His breathing was erratic, and he couldn't stop himself from shaking. He pressed himself into the back corner of the cell, wide eyes tracking every move the doctor made, his heart beating wildly in his chest. Upon Izuku's startle, the doctor had stopped his approach. His eyebrows raised slightly in surprise, still taking in the huddled figure barely a few feet away from him, cowering in the corner. Surprise soon turned to delight, a wicked smile twisting on the man's face. He stepped towards Izuku slowly, stopping to kneel in front of the boy. Izuku flinched, bringing his arms up and around his head in a protective measure, his eyes shut tightly. He wanted the doctor to leave, to go away, go away, go away. The man extended his hand, reaching out his fingers to brush against Izuku's cowering arm. Izuku flinched so hard his head hit the stone wall behind him, a sob breaking out of his throat before he could stop it. He covered his mouth tightly, eyes stinging with unshed tears, forcing himself to open his eyes to watch the doctor, to remain vigilant. The doctor's dark eyes, lacking the cover of his goggles, were filled with delight. Suddenly, the doctor retracted his hand, still kneeling in front of Izuku, as a small chuckle escaped his lips. "Interesting," he muttered to himself. Izuku could only look at the man before him in confusion. He didn't understand what was happening. The doctor had been creepy before, but not like this, never like this. Was it a test? A new way to torture him, to rip apart his psyche? If so, it was working. It was working, and Izuku wanted it to stop. Still chuckling quietly, the doctor continued. "Before our little stint with Eraserhead, you had become much less reactive. I suppose it came with time. But now? Well, it's almost like your first day here. It wasn't expected or intended, but still a nice side effect. I must say I enjoy seeing the fear in your eyes. The doctor grinned again, his face alight with sick satisfaction. Izuku's terror lessened, replaced with a searing anger. The BSTRD was toying with him. Clenching his teeth, Izuku's eyes darted from the man in front of him, so close Izuku could reach out, could hit him, could do something, and to the women standing still outside the cell. They both had their heads down in a show of obedience. It was a mistake. He made up his mind in a second. Izuku knew escaping wasn't likely, and he would never try to get away without Eraserhead, but he could do some damage right now. The doctor didn't seem to notice Izuku's eyes flashing with fury, too busy going on about whatever sick and twisted thing he was fascinated with this time. Izuku took the man's brief moment of distraction to launch himself forward, ignoring the fear and disgust at being in such close proximity to the disgusting a-hole, slamming his head as hard as he could into the doctor's skull. The doctor staggered backwards, and Izuku rushed to his feet, dashing out of the still open cell door and running down the hallway, leaving the doctor and his assistants behind. Ignoring the hammering ache of his head and the startled yell of, "Get him!" from the doctor, Izuku ran as fast as he could, not bothering to look back. His bare feet slapped loudly against the stone floor and his lungs ached as he struggled to breathe, but he felt so free. Izuku wasn't a very muscular individual, but when it came to running, oh boy, could he run. Even with an injured ankle, he was faster than most. He had lots of practice running away from Kaken Katsuki and his lackeys between classes and after school, and this wasn't much different. A little more life-threatening but still similar. He could see a divide in the hallway ahead, one path going left while the other went right. Panicking slightly, Izuku chose the path to the left, feet skidding against the ground in an attempt to keep himself upright after the sharp turn. He could still hear the pounding footsteps behind him, but they sounded quieter than before. His heart leaping in a mixture of terror and excitement, Izuku realized that he was outrunning the doctor. He was actually doing it. A small smile worked its way onto his face, growing wider and wider as he turned his head back, still running furiously. He didn't know where he got the confidence. Maybe it was thoughts of Katsuki's brashness or the sheer incredulousness of the situation, but Izuku found himself shouting in the direction of the doctor. "Eat my dust, you pedo fucker." A laugh bubbled in the back of Izuku's throat as he turned forward again, only to slam into something solid. Or rather, someone. The figure was thrown backwards with a low oof. Izuku had been going so fast that when he ran into the mystery person, he was thrown on top of them, rolling harshly over their body, skin scraping horribly on the stone floor as his hands tried to slow his tumble. Izuku's head smacked painfully into the ground, his vision blurring. He tried to get up to run, barely managing a few steps before stumbling, landing on his knees. But the doctor was getting closer and his breathing seemed to stutter, so he clambered upwards, running, more like staggering, forwards. He didn't make it very far before a hand grabbed the back of his shirt, pulling him back down onto the ground. His shoulders made hard contact with stone, and he gasped in pain. A leather boot-clad foot collided with his chest, pinning him to the ground mercilessly, knocking the air from his lungs. Izuku tried to grab the foot and throw it off of himself, but the figure held strong and wouldn't budge. Fingers still grabbing hopelessly at the boot on his chest, Izuku looked up with hazy vision at the figure holding him down. He was met with caramel eyes that would almost have been pretty if it weren't for the wrath burning in their pupils. The figure, a man, Izuku idly noted, had short brown hair and the palest skin he had ever seen. The most distinguishing feature was the man's mask. It was like the beak of a bird, colored red with golden studs running the length of the material. The man wore white leather gloves and a dark green jacket with a purple feather boa-like neck. Almost like Big Bird from that old Prequark show Izuku had seen a few times. He was tall, lithe, and didn't look very muscular, but had no problem keeping Izuku pinned to the ground with a single foot. Hearing the doctor's thundering footsteps and wheezing breaths approaching quickly, Izuku doubled his efforts to remove the stranger's foot from his chest, resorting to slapping at the boot pitifully. The stranger responded in kind, pressing down even harder. At this point, Izuku could barely breathe. The pressure on his chest restricted the movement of his lungs. He was gasping for air, fighting a battle he couldn't win. Black dots swarmed his vision. Izuku struggled to come up with a solution, some way to get out, but couldn't think of anything, couldn't do anything. It felt like forever before the doctor and his assistants rounded the corner, stopping suddenly at the sight of Izuku being pinned to the floor. Izuku couldn't see it, but the doctor's face had gone incredibly pale as he made eye contact with the mysterious stranger. Still out of breath and obviously frazzled, the doctor tried to speak. Mr. Overhaul. You're early. As you can see, there was a bit of a miscalculation. The masked figure held up a palm, signaling the doctor to stop his rambling. His eyes were furious, his very presence enough to stop the man in his tracks. Izuku was too tired and out of breath to be scared. A part of his brain was curious. This was the first time he had ever seen, heard more like, the doctor so scared. Who was this Overhaul guy? Izuku's oxygen-deprived, barely coherent thoughts were interrupted as the man spoke. His voice was quiet and low but freezing cold, with an anger that could only be described as deadly. Why, is there a child running around my facilities? It was less of a question and more of a demand. The doctor paled even more, if that was even possible. Well, sir, we were just taking him to be cleaned up as you had asked when he made a run for it. This is patient 13-9B, the one I reported about. Gulping audibly, the doctor waited with bated breath for his superior's response. The man's cold gaze seemed to pierce the doctor for an eternity, before moving to Izuku's still struggling form. His eyes narrowed. We will discuss your failure at a future time. Get the subject out of my sight and scrub down. You have 30 minutes to get him clean and into the experiment chambers. You won't get a second chance. The doctor's relief could be heard in his voice, obviously thankful to not have been killed right then and there. Yes, of course, Mr. Overhaul, sir. We'll get him cleaned as you like. Overhaul turned his attention once more to Izuku. He pressed his boot harder against the boy's chest, so hard Izuku couldn't breathe at all. Choked gasps escaped his lips, his hands shaking as he clawed at his throat with one hand, while trying to force the man's boot off with the other. Tears poured out of his eyes, the lack of oxygen making Izuku's head pound and his body heavy. Fixing Izuku with a final glare, the man removed his foot and stepped to the side carefully, making sure to avoid Izuku's shaking form as he continued his path down the hallway, past the doctor without a second glance backwards. Izuku remained on the ground, gasping for air and coughing uncontrollably, his chest heaving. Once Overhaul's footsteps receded, the doctor snapped at his assistants. Grab him and take him to the baths. I'm going to go prepare the lab. I don't trust myself near him right now. Overhaul needs him alive and I'm very close to killing the cretin right now. The assistants nodded silently, moving in tandem to lift and carry Izuku to wherever the baths were. Izuku couldn't find the strength to fight them off. He was still recovering from almost suffocating, and his run had depleted him of much of his energy. His eyes fell shut, head and body aching as the two women carried him away. When Izuku opened his eyes several minutes later, he was in some sort of bathroom? The room was a fairly decent size, with tile flooring and the usual stone walls. To Izuku's surprise, the room was warm. It was the warmest he had been since his kidnapping. Steam from a nearby bath curled dreamily in the air, humid and puffy and delightful. Oddly enough, Izuku felt a sense of peace in this new and strange environment. Several showerheads adorned the far walls with privacy sheets separating them, drains embedded in the ground below. To his left, Izuku saw a large curtain from which all the steam was escaping under. Still too weak to move very much, Izuku could only lay motionless as he was carried beyond the curtain and into the bath section of the room. A large, clear pool of water lay in this area, steaming heavily and radiating warmth that seemed to coat Izuku's entire being. It was like an in-ground pool, similar to those found in most American hotels, except this one was obviously heated. It was shallow on one end, with a few stone stairs leading into the water, and deeper on the opposite end. The two women carrying him deposited him gently on a nearby bench. He hadn't noticed that earlier, beginning to strip him of his clothes. At this, the fog previously occupying Izuku's brain quickly dissipated, replaced with its familiar sharpness and panic. He tried to push off their prying hands, tried to tug his shirt back around his shoulders, but his attempts were weak and shaky, and the two women were insistent and firm. Yet, for some reason, they weren't harsh. Even when Izuku scratched their arms and went to bite one of their hands, he wasn't incredibly proud of that one. They never hit him, never went to discipline him or yell at him. Instead, they simply continued in their efforts to remove Izuku of his clothing. Eventually growing too tired to fight back and realizing that the two women meant him no harm, Izuku relaxed slightly. He was still furiously uncomfortable at being so exposed in the presence of others, but he would much rather it be the two mystery women than the doctor. Once they stripped him of all his clothing, the two women who were much stronger than they looked heaved Izuku up and began their journey to the stairs of the bath. One of the women, the taller of the two, stayed holding Izuku gently while the other went to gather supplies. Izuku fuzzily noted that the women were wearing what looked like pale beige jumpsuits, loosely fitted with the sleeves and the legs rolled up so as to not drag in the water. He looked up at the woman holding him, trying to study her face with his still blurry vision. She looked young, probably in her early 20s, but she had dark bags under her eyes and obvious stress lines marring her face. Her eyes, a dark brown similar to the color of her hair, were warm and inviting, but refused to meet Izuku's directly. Izuku mumbled out a question, asking for her name, but she didn't answer. So Izuku would just call her Kashoku. He'd normally think of a better name, but his head was swimming and his vision was still blurry, so Kashoku would have to do for now. He'd be able to remember it at the very least. Kashoku held him silently, keeping him grounded in their position on the steps of the bath as her colleague made her way back with some newly acquired soap and brushes. Both women were now waist deep in the water, guiding Izuku slowly down the steps and into the shallow part of the bath. The uncomfortable feeling of vulnerability began to fade as the earlier fuzziness made its way back, the warmth of the bath lulling him into an unguarded and comfortable dozing. The truth was, Izuku was tired. Exhausted, really. And the bath was so very warm. The tenseness of his muscles relaxed, his aching shoulders soothed. The two women lathered his body in soap, scrubbing all of the collected dirt and grime off of his skin. They weren't harsh, but they were certainly persistent. They paid especially close attention to cleaning off the blood that had since dried on his skin, somehow doing so without overly aggravating the still fresh wounds. With the way they were scrubbing his body, Izuku was sure he'd be spotless soon. They washed his hair with swift and firm hands, Izuku almost melting into the touch. He was like putty in their grasp, far too tired to be embarrassed and so touch-starved that having someone wash his hair was like heaven on earth. Still in a daze, Izuku could only watch with half-lidded eyes as the two women finished washing his body and moved on to his nails. Pulling him to the edge of the bath, they lifted his hands to a wooden bin of sorts as they began trimming his nails, the clippings falling into the bin as they went. His feet experienced the same treatment, his nails scrubbed diligently with a small brush afterwards. The cleaning process continued for another few minutes as the two women checked over his body meticulously for any signs of dirt or grime. As they did this, Izuku let his mind wander lazily. He wondered why they were being so nice to him, why he was getting cleaned so thoroughly, why the facility even had such a nice bathhouse to begin with. He wondered who that man was, and why the doctor was so scared of him. He wondered where Eraserhead was, wondered if he was safe. He thought about what the doctor had called him. Patient 13-9B. As if he weren't the only one. He didn't like thinking about that, so he thought about something else. A facility this big, with a FING bathhouse, must have cost a lot of money. Whoever had kidnapped him must be extremely wealthy. Izuku's thoughts traveled back to the strange man from earlier. The doctor had called him Overhaul? Was he the one who had Izuku kidnapped? Was he the mastermind behind all of the quirk experimentation, or just a financial supporter? It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. Izuku's train of thought was interrupted as he was gently pulled back to the steps of the bath, one of the women helping him climb the stairs as the other went to grab some towels and fresh clothes. They began drying him off, and he couldn't help but drift into a deeper daze. The towels were so soft and fluffy and warm, and the clothes were clean and surprisingly comfortable. The shorter of the women, the one with dark red hair and a smattering of freckles, began brushing his still damp curls. He asked for her name too, although his words were slurred just a tiny bit. She didn't respond either, so he named her Akai in his mind. Her hands were gentle and warm, and the softness of her action alone had him closing his eyes, starting to fall into a light daze. Unfortunately, the past 20 minutes? 30? Izuku really had no idea, had been too good to last. Right as he was beginning to slip into the warm and soft embrace of sleep, the bathhouse door slammed open with a bang, startling Izuku and the two women. Izuku's eyes flew open, his head snapping up to attention. Eyes wide, he looked around frantically for the source of the noise, heart thudding and brain still painfully hazy with exhaustion. He could hear footsteps pounding against the tile, coming closer and closer, and Izuku's heart sank. He recognized those footsteps. Immediately, he tried to use what little strength he had left to hide somewhere, anywhere, but the hands on his arms gripped him tighter. He looked up at Kashoku, looked into her warm eyes, pleading with her silently to let him go, but she only averted her gaze, a look of guilt and sorrow hidden from Izuku's line of sight. All too soon the doctor yanked the curtain in front of the bath open with it. Screech as the metal bar scraped against the curtain hangers. Izuku swallowed his feelings of betrayal as he turned his gaze from the woman on his left down to the tiled floor, refusing to look at the approaching man ahead. Of course, no one would help him here. How could he forget? Bile stung the back of his throat, and Izuku could barely hear the doctor's brief exchange with the two women, but he forced himself to listen. He wasn't safe, he needed to pay attention. Is he ready? The doctor's low voice rang loud in the quiet room, his tone tense. He was met with a curt nod from Akai. Wasting no time, the doctor stepped forward to yank Izuku from his assistant's hold. Izuku stumbled slightly, still weak from his previous escapade, as the man dragged him through the room and out into the cold hallway. He was hit with a violent shiver as the warm air of the bathroom was suddenly replaced with a frigid and uncomfortable draft. The hand on his upper arm only tightened, gripping him so fiercely that Izuku was sure he would be left with a bruise. With a quick and impatient pace, the doctor set off down the hallway, still pulling Izuku behind him. Izuku's bare feet slapped against the ground, staggering every few steps, the plop, plop, plop of his steps almost comically accompanying the harsh clicks of the doctor's shoes meeting stone. Normally, Izuku would struggle and pull his arm to free himself, but at the moment he hardly had the energy to keep himself upright. Everything felt sluggish, his body heavy and hard to control. If it weren't for the arm on his shoulder, Izuku would have face-planted in the hallway immediately. He tried to pay attention to the path they were taking, but after counting 5 right turns and an unknown number of lefts, Izuku abandoned his efforts. He could barely remember his last name in this pathetic state. Trying to remember the layout of a labyrinth was hopeless. Eventually they approached a simple metal door, its only distinguishing feature being a plaque on the right of the door frame with an Exam Number 1 printed in small black lettering. Under the plaque lay a keypad, with no markings or numbers, only a series of unlabeled buttons and what looked to be a fingerprint scanner. Izuku watched as the doctor punched in a code, hiding the order in which he pressed the buttons so Izuku couldn't see, pressing his finger onto the scanner swiftly. The door unlocked with a resounding click, opened by the doctor as he dragged Izuku inside behind him. Izuku took a second to look around him, blinking furiously at the sight. The room was full of medical-looking equipment, computers, tools, tables, and so on. It was like the doctor's office on steroids, and far more high-tech. Everything was white, the walls, the floor, the lights. It smelled like a hospital. And at the back of the room, his heart froze. At the back of the room was a metal chair, not unlike the one in the doctor's office, but positioned to be nearly standing with thick leather straps hanging almost innocently where the arms, legs, head, and even chest would be positioned. Izuku knew better. This chair, hell, this whole room was far from innocent. As if sensing his growing panic, the doctor quickly pulled Izuku towards the chair, slamming his back against the metal frame, immediately moving to strap down his arms to prevent him from moving. Izuku's breaths came in quick succession now, growing ever closer to being considered hyperventilating. The feeling of metal against his skin, of being trapped, was too much. But he didn't have the strength to push the doctor off of him, only able to watch as he finished tightening the restraints painfully. The man glared at Izuku ferociously, obviously taking pleasure in his fear. Leaning in closer, he smiled at the flinch it got him. "You thought I was bad? Overhaul is like nothing you've ever seen, my boy. You'll learn never to try and run again. You've made him very, very angry, and trust me when I say that he's especially vicious when he's angry." Izuku could feel the doctor's breath on his face, could smell the gross heaviness that came from it, could see far too closely the overly satisfied grin on the man's face. His words only made Izuku's anxiety swell. He knew better than to try and thrash in his restraints. He'd already made the doctor angry, and there was no use wasting that energy. So, Izuku squeezed his eyes shut and tried to focus on calming himself down. He filled his thoughts with good, happy things. Like math problems and cats and Eraserhead. Eraserhead, was he okay? Were they going to torture him too? Was he hurt or worse? Izuku forced himself to abandon that line of thinking. It was only causing him to panic, and it wouldn't do Eraser any good if he panicked. He needed to think rationally, needed to calm himself down. He concentrated on his breathing, timing his inhales and exhales until they were steadier than before, less shaky. Eventually, the fuzziness in his head faded slightly, allowing him the ability to actually think coherently. Izuku tried to list the things he knew in his head. He knew that he was about to meet this mysterious overhaul again, and sometime soon. He knew it would be some type of experimentation, most likely very painful. He knew that he had never been in this room before, and that this overhaul person was someone important, someone with a lot of influence. He knew that, for whatever reason, this was different from the doctor's experiments. But there were so many things that he didn't know. He didn't know why he was cleaned so thoroughly before being brought here. He didn't know why Overhaul was only appearing now, after 5 months. He didn't know Overhaul's quirk, or what he would do to him. He didn't know what was happening to Eraserhead. That last thought caused his throat to tighten, tears forming behind his eyelids. He was scared. Ever since Eraserhead had appeared, Izuku had been conflicted. On one hand, he was elated to meet his favorite hero, and beyond comforted to have another human being to interact with, one that was kind and warm and everything Izuku had needed since getting kidnapped, and well before that too. On the other hand, Izuku wished that Eraserhead had never gotten dragged into this mess. He wished Eraserhead were far, far away from here, home with his family and friends and everyone that probably missed him so much right now. He was terrified that they were hurting him right now, terrified that they would experiment on him like they had with Izuku. Izuku wished with every fiber of his being that they would let Eraserhead go, or hell, that they would torture Izuku twice as much if it only meant that Eraserhead wouldn't be hurt. The ache of helplessness was sharp in Izuku's chest, a pang so deep and cruel that for a second, he wondered if the experimentation had started already. As if hearing his thoughts, the door's lock clicked open, the thick metal swinging inwards and clanging shut once more. Izuku opened his eyes to see none other than Overhaul, in all his stupid big bird glory. The man's stoic expression seemed to cut right through Izuku, leaving him breathless and absolutely terrified. Behind him, drawing Izuku's attention, were several individuals wearing white lab coats, all making their way to their stations and occupying themselves with some type of work. Izuku had never had so many people present for an examination. Usually it was just the doctor, maybe a guard or two. But if Izuku counted correctly, there were 7 people, not including the doctor and Overhaul, milling about the room. None of them spoke, and the only noise heard was the whirring of computers, the pattering of feet, and the clicking of pens. He brought his attention back to Overhaul, who was still staring at him. Izuku's throat went horribly dry. The look in Overhaul's eyes was dangerous. It filled Izuku with a strong primal instinct to run, to flee, but he was stuck like a deer in headlights. He was frozen in fear, only able to watch as Overhaul made his way to where Izuku was strapped down. Careful and concise, Overhaul undid the strap on the glove of his right hand, removing each finger's sleeve individually before pulling off the glove entirely, holding it in his free hand. He had stopped his approach around a foot in front of Izuku, and Izuku couldn't move. Lifting his gloveless hand, Overhaul reached out to touch Izuku's arm, all while still maintaining suffocating eye contact with him. His fingers made contact with Izuku's skin, and Izuku flinched, eyes shutting tightly. He was waiting for something to happen, some horrible quirk or scalpel or something, but nothing did. After a few seconds of silence, Izuku opened his eyes slowly, curiously, to meet Overhaul's calculating gaze. Nothing had happened. Why was nothing happening? Overhaul's eyes lit up, and Izuku could feel the faintest spark against his arm. And in the span of a single second, his whole world crumbled to pieces. Chisaki Kai, also known as Overhaul, is a complicated man. He despises filth and germs and has spent years of his life devoted to finding a way to eradicate quirks, believing them to be unclean in nature and the cause of society's many detriments. He doesn't like to be near other human beings unless absolutely necessary. It's safe to say that he isn't a people person. Rarely do people fascinate him enough to warrant a physical appearance. Yet after years of studying and months of scheming, hundreds of failed experiments and a dead end he couldn't get over, he finds himself face to face with a human being that could be the very solution to everything he has ever desired. Never has Overhaul deemed another human being of such importance until this moment. It's a strange feeling, especially when said human was strapped to a chair in front of him, passed out after several rounds of being disassembled and reassembled with Overhaul's quirk. He couldn't help but stare. Fluffy green hair lay scattered around the young boy's face, freckles painted across his nose and cheeks. If he were anyone else, the child would be found cute. Overhaul, however, didn't find things cute. No, the boy in front of him wasn't cute. Far better, in fact. He was useful. He was special. Overhaul watched the slow rise and fall of the unconscious boy's chest with fascination. Never before had he been so transfixed. Something about the boy drew him in. It was due, in part, to his quirklessness, of that Overhaul was certain. He had been able to locate the part of the boy's brain that the doctor had talked about, and it was quite the discovery. A few more sessions and some more experimentation, and he was sure he'd be able to recreate it in a lab and finally create a cure for society to become clean again. But that wasn't all. No, there was something else. It was what Overhaul saw in the seconds before disassembling the boy. It was the look in his eyes when he had raised his head. The child's dark green eyes had been full of fear and anger and vulnerability, but underneath all of that, Overhaul could almost drown in the boy's innocence. In all his years of work and life, Chisaki Kai had never seen such purity in the eyes of another human. It was exhilarating. He didn't know such people could exist. Even after being covered in blood, after passing out from the pain of being taken apart, Overhaul could still see it, could still feel it. It was like the child's spirit was unbreakable, like his soul was a piece of heaven that only the truly blessed could ever experience. And Overhaul wanted it. He wanted the purity, the cleanliness that the boy possessed. And he was going to stop at nothing to get it. When Izuku awoke, he was back in his normal cell. It was almost surreal how grateful he felt waking up there, how thankful he was that he was somewhere he recognized, somewhere he could almost consider familiar. He lay still for several moments in his bed, eyes peering lifelessly at the bunk suspended above him. He couldn't move, of that he was certain. Everything was fuzzy, except the pain. Every inch of his body screamed because of it, crying out with each breath that he was unlucky enough to take. He could still feel Overhaul's hand on his arm, the horrible sensation of his body being ripped apart strand by strand, his cells dying too fast to regenerate. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut tightly, willing the sickening memories to disappear. He knew, if he wasn't careful, that he would be driven insane if he let himself relive that torture. He didn't have that luxury. Right now. Turning his head slightly, biting back a cry at the pain the movement caused, he looked around the cell. His heart skipped a beat. Sitting against the far wall with his knees tucked close to his body and his arms folded around his head was Aizawa, seemingly asleep. Izuku let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, relief flooding his system. Tears streamed down his face slowly, the mere pressure of them stinging his overly sensitive skin. He straightened his head, gritting his teeth at the sensation before closing his eyes again, giving himself a moment to rest. He focused on breathing, waiting for his racing heart to slow in his chest. And as he did, he thought about the last few days. Eraserhead, his favorite hero of all time, is thrown into a cell with him. He was then used as collateral against Eraser in a terrifying showdown with the Doctor. He watched him collapse, with no idea if he was dead or alive. He had been knocked out and tormented by the Doctor before running straight into the most frightening man Izuku ever had the horror of meeting. After almost dying of suffocation, he was moved to another unknown location, scrubbed raw and tortured. No, not tortured. Izuku had died, Overhaul had killed him, then brought him back to life, then killed him again. Izuku could feel as his skin was torn from his body, fibers of his flesh being ripped from his muscles in what felt like years but was really a matter of milliseconds. His muscles and bones followed shortly, everything tinted red, red, red. He couldn't hear anything, couldn't see anything, but he was awake, he was still conscious. Izuku was sure that he was screaming, but he couldn't feel his throat or hear the noise, so maybe he was wrong. His body didn't feel like his own, didn't act like his own. He could feel it shifting, mutating, dissolving all at once. Everything and nothing, he could feel it, could taste it, could smell it, and then it was gone, gone, gone. The only real constant was agony. His nerve endings were being vaporized and shoved back together in quick succession, so quick he was in shock, he had to be. Yet, he was conscious, he was awake, he could feel it. If he were able to think at all, he would pray to an unanswering God, would pray to pass out, to stop, to die. But he wasn't able to think, and so his prayers went unsaid. He was trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of death and regeneration, thrown out of the grave faster than he had been pushed into it. His body yearned for death, ached for everything to stop, even if it meant he would never wake again. Especially if it meant he would never wake again. Every ounce of his being hoped that the reassembly wouldn't happen this time, that he would remain dust. Because dust doesn't feel pain, dust doesn't bleed or scream or cry. Oh, how he wished. Izuku tore himself out of the flashback, chest heaving, sweat burning against his skin. He needed to do something, anything. His whole body seared as he tried to prop himself up in his bed, arms shaking with the effort. A cry escaped past his clenched teeth, his vision darkening rapidly. He didn't get very far before a set of strong hands wrapped around his torso, guiding him gently upwards to rest his back against the bed's railing. After ensuring he was steady and not going to fall over, the hands released him. The pressure of their hold, although careful and light, seemed to almost tear through Izuku's skin as if it were paper. He breathed through the pain, trying desperately not to pass out. "I didn't realize you were up, problem child. You need to take it easy. They really did a number on you." Aizawa's low, comforting voice was like music to Izuku's ears. Before he could stop himself, he was crying again. Silent tears streamed steadily down his freckled cheeks. He was getting used to how they burned now. Through his blurry vision, Izuku could make out Aizawa in his peripheral, brows furrowed and face contorted with worry. His dark hair hung limp and greasy around his darkened eyes, lined with deep bags. Scanning him quickly up and down, Izuku didn't see any obvious injuries. The pit in his stomach lessened at that, if only a bit. He shifted his gaze downwards, deliberately not moving his head, taking stock of his own body, which was entirely covered in bandages. Every inch, from his toes to his neck, were swathed in white, disappearing under his simple cotton shirt and shorts. He blinked at the sudden flurry of dark spots in his vision, willing them to go away. "ID kid? You with me?" Aizawa's voice rung out once again, startling Izuku. The blurring at the corners of his eyes dissipated slightly as he urged himself to focus. He returned his attention to the man at his side, his head clearer than before. The worry that Izuku had seen on the hero's face appeared to have doubled. The man's mouth was pinched in a tight line, and his hands were shaking? Guilt ate away at Izuku's insides at the sight. He hadn't meant to make him worry, to cause such trouble, especially for his favorite hero. He opened his mouth to speak, to reassure him, but it took a few seconds for Izuku to remember how to form words properly. "Sorry, Eraserhead sir," was the only thing Izuku managed to rasp out before his throat refused to work anymore, the words almost grating against his. Aizawa let out a huff of air, eyes softening. Kid, you have nothing to apologize for. I'm just glad I'm glad you're awake. The hero trailed off before continuing, his voice tense. And I told you, call me Shoyuda or Aizawa or whatever, no need for such formality. His gaze was so warm, so kind, that Izuku could only nod, too overwhelmed to try and speak again. He attempted to raise his hand to wipe the tears from his face but was unable to. Seeing his struggle, Aizawa reached an arm forward, stopping before touching Izuku's skin. He fixed Izuku with questioning eyes, as if asking, "Is this okay?" This only made Izuku cry harder, but he nodded regardless. Aizawa's thumb swept the tears off his cheeks softly as he shifted his body to reach the boy better. The pain was more manageable now, and Izuku let out a shaky breath, leaning into the man's reassuring touch. It was such a simple action, but it was warm and soft and human. He was safe. He was safe. He was safe. Sobs racked Izuku's frame at the feeling, forcing their way up his chest and out of his mouth. Aizawa only continued to wipe the tears from his face, reaching with his other arm to hesitantly hold Izuku's shoulder. After ensuring that the gesture wasn't hurting him any more than he already was, Aizawa pulled Izuku close, moving his head to rest on his shoulder as he held the boy in his arms with a softness Izuku didn't know existed in the world. He petted the boy's head carefully, carting his fingers through Izuku's hair, stopping every now and then to pick out specks of dried blood in the dark curls. No more words were exchanged between the two. The room was quiet still. They sat like that for a while, listening to the other's inhales and exhales, comforting each other with the assurance of their heartbeats. Izuku didn't have to ask Aizawa to stay with him. The man, after kneeling by Izuku's side for what felt like hours, climbed into the small bed next to him, cautiously avoiding jostling Izuku as he settled beside him. Izuku couldn't find it in himself to thank him out loud, but he squeezed his hands gently, pulling them close to his chest. Aizawa guided his head to his chest, cradling it as if he were something precious, something special. It was a nice thought. In Aizawa's arms, the agony of his existence didn't bother him as much. His eyes drooped shut, and Izuku found himself drifting off to sleep without even realizing it. Izuku was taken from the cell 3 more times that week. Each session seemed to last longer and longer. The first was only an hour. The last was 4. Afterwards, without fail, Izuku would be dumped back into the cell, limp and motionless, covered in bloody bandages. Every time, Aizawa would race over to the boy's unmoving body and check frantically for a pulse before moving him gently onto his mattress. Sometime after Izuku would finally wake, 12 to 24 hours later, he would be whisked off to the next session and the process would repeat. If Aizawa had been worried before, he was borderline hysterical now. He didn't know who was torturing him, didn't know if it was the doctor or someone, or something else, didn't know how to stop it and didn't know how to help. He spent every waking moment he could monitoring his kid, constantly making sure Izuku was still breathing. He tried to force Izuku to eat and drink something, attempting to clean up his wounds the best he could. The kid was asleep most of the time now anyways. When he was awake, he was practically incoherent. He wasn't able to move much on his own, and talking with Aizawa was impossible. The cell was very, very quiet without the boy's familiar questions and mumbling. He didn't realize how attached he'd gotten to the kid until now. It hadn't taken very long, but Aizawa really cared about Izuku. He cherished every mini-rant of his, every question about his support gear, every plea for a cool pro-hero story from Aizawa. Izuku was smart and kind and selfless, always caring more about Aizawa's well-being than his own. He was just a kid. He didn't deserve any of this. Aizawa wanted him to be safe, wanted him to feel safe. But he didn't know how to actually do that. So at night, when Izuku was sleeping fitfully, Aizawa would search the cell for anything he could use as a weapon or to escape, spending hours scheming and planning and going insane. He'd scrutinized every inch of the walls, the floors, the ceiling, nothing. There was nothing he could break off, no loose brick or sharp edge. He could throw the bar of soap at the guards, but he didn't think that would do him much good. Aizawa found himself talking to his husband in his mind while Izuku was unconscious, kneeling by his bed with his eyes closed and his head in his hands. It kept him occupied, helped to ease the edge of panic that threatened to overtake him in the silence of the room. God, Zashi, I wish you were here. I don't know what to do. I don't know where I am, don't know who I'm up against. Hell, I don't even know how I ended up in the mess. But I'm here now, and Izuku, his throat tightened uncomfortably, eyes stinging. He needs help. You're so much better with kids than I am. You'd know what to do, what to say. Please, just hang in there for me. I'll be home soon. Well, as soon as I can be. Thinking of Hizashi seemed to make things more bearable, if only a little, so as the torture continued, Aizawa talked to his husband more and more often, imagining what he would do if he were in Aizawa's shoes. The kid came back after 2 hours this time. It wasn't as long last time. He's so filthy and cold. He's been unconscious this entire time. He's still breathing, but it's shallower than it should be. He's dying, I can feel it, I don't know what to do. I tried to stop the guards, but I've been tossed 3 times already and they just take him and leave. His wounds are like he's being ripped apart, again. And again and again. Aizawa grabbed his hair and pulled on it tightly, squeezing his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. I don't care if it's me. I'd rather it was. But not Izuku. Anything but him. Zashi, I don't know what to do. Please, tell me what to do. Please, please, please. On the really bad nights, the ones where Izuku would return and wouldn't wake up even after hours and hours, Aizawa would sing. Kneeling by his side, holding Izuku's small hands in his own, he would warble out some old songs, usually Hizashi's favorite, just like his husband did for him whenever he ended up in the hospital. It was desperate, Aizawa knew that. But he just wanted his kid to wake up, to be okay, to know that he was here, and he had exhausted all other options. So, Aizawa sang. His voice was gruff and unsteady, barely above a whisper. It wasn't pretty, like Zashi's was, but it was better than the suffocating silence that surrounded them. When he was done singing, the cell was quiet. Izuku still lay asleep, his chest moving slowly up and down. His face was peacefully blank, framed by limp, dark hair. Aizawa averted his gaze, the sight of his kid like that too much to bear. He swallowed thickly, staring intensely at the tiny hands still in his grasp. As he went to draw his hands away, he felt a twitch of movement. Aizawa startled, looking sharply upwards to see familiar Viridian eyes staring back at him. The hand in his grasp twitched again, now holding his in a loose grip. He could only stare, a lump growing in his throat, tears streaming steadily down his face. He didn't dare remove his hands from Izuku's to wipe them away. Hey, Zoa. Izuku's broken voice could barely be understood, raspy and hoarse. I'm back. It was the first thing he'd said since the first session, and it was barely more than 3 words, but Aizawa could have sobbed with relief. He knew it was a little different. Izuku had never called him by his name before, only ever calling him by his hero name, which told Aizawa that the kid was probably pretty out of it. But still it was enough, it was more than enough. He restrained himself from launching at the kid, instead wrapping his arms gently around Izuku, pressing his face into the crook of his neck as Izuku shuddered. Don't ever scare me like that again. Kid, don't you ever leave me like that. Izuku only wrapped his arms around Aizawa's shoulders, wincing at the movement but continuing nevertheless. Sorry, Zawa, I'm sorry. Aizawa just cried harder at that. He was tired. Hell, he knew they both were exhausted. So he crawled into bed next to Izuku, just like he had just days ago, pulling the kid against his chest in a protective embrace. Izuku curled his hands into Aizawa's shirt, grabbing on as tight as the bandages would allow. Aizawa only pulled him closer, tucking his head under his chin. After a week of no sleep, of constant worrying, of pure and unadulterated fear, Aizawa finally let himself relax with his kid in his arms. The two fell asleep together like that, safe. For now, at least, Aizawa and Izuku were, for the most part, left alone over the next few weeks. On occasion, a guard would pull Aizawa out of the cell for the occasional checkup, which consisted of simple blood tests, physical examinations, and other suspiciously normal medical practices, but that was it. No more torture. Izuku was left to heal, recovering his strength slowly, day after day, and Aizawa took care of him as best as he could. After what must have been 2 full weeks, Izuku was speaking again, joking around with Aizawa and questioning him relentlessly about anything hero-related. He was still mostly bedridden, but far more energetic than he had been after overhaul. Izuku hadn't told Aizawa about the man, unable to form the words. Aizawa never pressed him about it either, which almost made things worse. Izuku knew he needed to tell Aizawa, to warn him, but every time he tried all he could think about was pain, 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 and his throat would close and his heart would race and he couldn't do it. But they were managing okay, now that they were left to their own devices. During this PRD of inactivity, Izuku and Aizawa found their own ways to pass the time. They drew each other pictures and played silly games, often spending hours just talking to one another. One night, after a competitive few rounds of tic-tac-toe, Izuku had won. Izuku approached Aizawa with something that had been on his mind for a while. "Racer, Aizawa?" Izuku started hesitantly. Do you think you could train me? To fight? I think it would help us later down the line if I knew how to fight too, and you're really good with self-defense. I mean, of course you are, you're Eraserhead for FS sake, that's pretty much your whole brand. Not that you can't do other things or anything. Aizawa cut off his ramblings with a soft chuckle. Izuku stopped, the tips of his ears feeling warmer than usual. Of course I'll train you, kid. It's going to be tough work, but we'll take it slow. Right now, though, you need to rest. It's illogical to try and work right now when your body is still recovering. Izuku's heart soared. He dreamt of a pro hero training him ever since he was a little kid, but he never thought it would actually happen, let alone with Eraserhead. Thank you so much, Eraserhead. Sorry, Aizawa. I'm still trying to get used to it. You don't have to call me Aizawa. Whatever you're comfortable with is fine. Izuku looked at the man in surprise. Once again, he was in awe over how laid back and kind Eraserhead Aizawa really was. He looked down at his hands, contemplative. After everything the hero had done for him, everything he had seen, it was only fair that he would refer to the man with some sense of familiarity. When you were still having trouble speaking, you would call me Zawa, sometimes. I figure it was easier than saying my full name. If you want, you can call me that. Izuku started, his cheeks blazing as he waved his hands frantically. I'm so sorry, I wasn't really thinking, I was just so out of it and your hero name was so hard to say. Oh god, that's so embarrassing. Looking up at Aizawa, Izuku could see a glint of amusement in the man's usually impassive eyes. Over the past few weeks together, Izuku had gotten better at reading the man and right now, he was clearly playing with him. Izuku stopped his rambling, fixing the underground hero with an angry look that was really just a pout. That's so mean. I'm going to call you Aizawa now just because you were teasing me. That finally got a laugh out of the hero. It was quiet and short, but genuine. It surprised Izuku, but he recovered quickly, laughing with Aizawa. You and my husband would get along great, he's always on my butt about making fun of him. Aizawa's tone was fond, but his eyes were sad. The light-hearted mood in the room shifted, tinged with a sense of sorrow that Aizawa rarely showed. He blinked rapidly, inhaling deeply before trying to change the subject. Anyways, why don't we? What's he like? Izuku's voice was soft, his eyes understanding. Aizawa looked at him for a moment, his eyes glossy, before glancing down, taking another deep breath. He's my sunshine. He is my everything and so much more. The hero's usually stoic voice was thick with affection. He's loud and vibrant and way too energetic, especially in the morning. He's great with kids and is the kindest person I've ever known. You would love him. And I know he would love you. Aizawa finally glanced Izuku's way, tears gone from his eyes as he schooled his expression. Izuku knew he was trying to be strong, trying to act like a hero, but he wished that Aizawa just let himself hurt, let himself feel. He'd work on it with him, Izuku promised himself. But Aizawa had already changed topics, guiding the conversation skillfully to something Izuku couldn't possibly ignore. In fact, you probably already know of him. He's a hero, just like me. I bet you could figure out who he is. Izuku's eyes lit up. He knew it was a diversion tactic, But it was working. Just when he thought Aizawa couldn't get any cooler, he finds out that the man is married to another pro-hero. Izuku literally couldn't think of anything that amazing. You're married to a pro-hero? That's so cool. The corners of Aizawa's mouth twitched upwards as he nodded. Izuku thought about what Aizawa had said, searching his brain for every hero he could think of. Okay, so he's loud and energetic, obviously male. I'm assuming he's an above-ground hero. Izuku's question was met with another nod. Well, I'm going to say it's not All Might. At that, Aizawa snorted, both out of humor and disgust. So that leaves... Well, not many male pro-heroes are known for having that much exuberance, let's just say. You said he's loud, maybe someone who works with his voice? Kind, energetic, good with kids. Don't tell me you're married to the voice hero, Present Mike. Bingo! Are you serious? That's awesome, I never would have guessed. He's just so, well, he's like the sun. But I guess that would make you his moon. Oh my god, I can't believe you're married to Present Mike. He's one of my favorite heroes. He did a segment on quirkless discrimination on his talk show, and he was so understanding and kind. Not to mention, Aizawa's eyes had gone wide, and Izuku trailed off. You okay, Zawa? Yeah, I just never thought about it that way. You're a real smart kid, you know that. The compliment stole the air from Izuku's lungs. For a moment, he thought Aizawa was joking. But with one look at the hero, Izuku knew that he wasn't. I'm not really, it's not. Izuku stumbled over his words, trying to think of something to say. Aizawa just watched, his expression unreadable. I'm pretty average, I think. I mean, my grades were always kinda bad, so, I wouldn't call myself smart, he mumbled, gaze falling to his hands. Smart. Aizawa had called him smart. But he wasn't smart, he knew that he wasn't because that's what everyone at school told him, what his mother always reminded him of. Well, I think you're pretty smart. I mean, you made your own code for FS sake. That has to count for something, Aizawa said encouragingly, his voice softer than it was before. Izuku didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything, and the room was quiet for a moment. Aizawa cleared his throat, changing the subject again. Speaking of kid, I've been meaning to ask you about that. Your code. Izuku was pulled out of his thoughts, looking up at Aizawa, his brows furrowed. But what about it? Well, maybe while you're still recovering you could teach it to me. It allows you the time to rest, and it could prove helpful if we both could communicate without the enemy knowing. And that wasn't what Izuku had expected. No one had ever been interested in his code before, let alone expressed any interest in actually learning it. It was odd, but also strangely nice. Of course. I would love to teach you. It might take a while though. Not that you aren't capable or anything, it's just that I designed it to be pretty much unbreakable. It took me almost 2 years to develop and memorize. Aizawa paused. Did you make this before you were kidnapped? Izuku froze. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing would come out. He sat, gaping like a fish for a solid 30 seconds before finally he found the ability to speak again. I made the code. Well, I guess it's a language? I made the language when I was in school. The other kids would get mad at me when I would analyze their quirks, so I had to disguise what I was writing. I was going to put everything in code anyways because it's kind of dangerous, my analysis, but that's why. I had a lot of free time too. Izuku trailed off, wishing desperately to move on to another topic. We can dive into your horrible school experience later. I'm sure Nedzu would love to destroy another school. Startled, Izuku met Aizawa's gaze, relaxing at his amused expression. I keep thinking you're serious, your poker face is really good. Aizawa wasn't joking, but Izuku didn't need to know that right now. Grabbing a blank piece of paper and some stray crayons lying nearby, Aizawa dumped them onto Izuku's blanketed lap playfully. Shall we begin? Izuku grinned, throwing a crayon back at Aizawa with a laugh. He was so excited. Everything was going to go great. Or more or less. After 3 hours of trying to explain the basics of his code to Aizawa, the man was about ready to quit. Kid, you said this was a code. This is the Fing equation for quantum mechanics, Aizawa sighed, looking at the dozens of scribbled-out characters in front of him. Haha, very funny. I told you it was going to take some time. Besides, quantum mechanics doesn't have one single equation, it's an entire subfield of physics. Fine, then this is every single equation for quantum mechanics. Izuku smiled, feeling a little sympathetic. The code, really more of a language, was definitely tricky. It was technically 3 separate languages, all developed by Izuku, that merged together in seemingly random, but carefully calculated, places. It was all an elaborate way to throw the reader off, to confuse them. Izuku had made it so intricate as a way to entertain himself, but it kind of spiraled out of control. Just a little bit. This may be a lost cause. That demon tongue looks like how I'd think a migraine would be written on paper. Laughing, Izuku shoved Aizawa's shoulder gently. Come on, Zoa, I know you can get it. Now, let's start at the beginning. This character means... As Izuku went over his code for what seemed like the 30th time, Aizawa just listened quietly, looking at him fondly, pointedly ignoring the ever-growing headache that had formed at the beginning of their lesson. He had long since given up actually learning the language, but Aizawa was just glad to see the kid so happy. It almost scared him how quickly he had grown attached. Hisashi had always told him he was a softie, but he never really thought so until now. His heart sank a little as he took in the reality of the situation. Izuku had a family. After they got out of this mess, which they would, he would go back to loving parents and friends, and they would part ways. Aizawa reprimanded himself mentally. Of course he would go back to his family. It was a good thing, it was the goal. It's not like Aizawa was his dad or anything. That was ridiculous. A small voice in the back of his head cried out, reminding him that he and Hisashi had been looking to adopt a child for years now, that Izuku was everything they had ever wanted in a kid, that there was obviously something off about the kid's home life. He couldn't think like that right now, couldn't think like that at all. He looked back up at Izuku, the boy still trying to explain his code as he waved his hands around animatedly, his eyes wide and bright. It made him look so painfully young. He was so painfully young. Aizawa nodded a few times, pretending to understand. His head hurt like a beach, but it was worth the smile on Izuku's face, the excitement in his voice as he talked about something he was passionate about, something he had worked incredibly hard on. This kid would be the death of him, of that Aizawa was sure. As their time in captivity progressed, Izuku and Aizawa developed a routine. In the mornings, after eating, 2 trays of food and some bottles of water were slipped under their door twice a day. The two would stretch and review information. Aizawa had long since given up learning Izuku's complex code, so they communicated through Japanese Sign Language, which Izuku had learnt before his capture in preparation for his hero career. Aizawa already knew it because his husband was deaf, so it worked out rather well. While Aizawa hadn't found any wires in his searches of the cell, he wanted to be absolutely sure that their plans weren't heard by the enemy. Call him paranoid, but he'd rather be safe than sorry. Aizawa and Izuku discussed the layout of the facility, the parts they had been taken at least, ways to exploit weaknesses of the doctor and his guards, possibly entry and exit points, etc. Izuku gave Aizawa information whenever possible, considering he had been there longer. But there were things the boy wasn't telling him, times where Izuku would pause, his hands falling to his lap and his eyes flashing with fear. Aizawa never pushed him, he was just a kid. He didn't deserve to relive the torture he'd already been forced to experience. He was sure that it was important and needed to be talked about eventually, but it could wait. After plotting and scheming, they would begin sparring. Aizawa had shown Izuku some basic moves, focusing on practicality over brute force, how to take a punch, how to fall correctly, how to block properly, and the likes. Now that Izuku was finally in better health, he was able to catch on fairly quickly. He was eager to learn, and took to fighting like a sponge to water. Aizawa knew that, if Izuku were one of his students at UA, he'd be at the top of the class without a doubt. Aizawa also taught Izuku some stealth tactics, how to walk without being detected, how to hide one's breathing, how to lie with a straight face. While this wasn't what he normally taught his younger students, they were both far from the classroom now. They needed to be stealthy if they ever hoped to escape with their lives, and so, Izuku had to learn. The kid had a little more trouble with these. He could move quietly enough, but he breathed too loudly when he got nervous, and his poker face needed work, to say the least. It took another week or two, but Izuku was making great progress. They would spend as much time training together as they could, interrupted every so often by a guard taking Aizawa. It was only ever Aizawa now, to another examination. He would come back bruised, battered, and slightly scarred, but nothing he couldn't handle. Aizawa had been a pro hero for a while now. Injuries were literally part of the job. Besides, it was nothing in comparison to what Izuku had been through. For whatever reason, they were going easy on Aizawa. Izuku had speculated that the doctor had to run fewer tests because Aizawa had a quirk. It wasn't a comforting thought. At night, after tiring themselves out from sparring and training and scheming, the pair would eat dinner and talk. Izuku usually held most of the conversation, as he was naturally more sociable than Aizawa, but the hero would chip in when appropriate. Sometimes Aizawa would tell old stories about his early days in the field, which always had Izuku looking at him with stars in his eyes. And then he started driving, the ATM still strapped to the back of his car. It was so loud, I swore I could practically see colors after that. Seriously? How did you catch him? Did you use your capture weapon on the wheels, or disconnect the machine from his car, or... I didn't have to. The dumbass ran into a pole before making it down the street, knocked himself out. That's so cool. Aizawa wasn't usually one who liked to talk much in general, let alone about himself or his life, but it made the kid happy. Ever since Izuku came back about a month ago, covered in bloody bandages and without the familiar light in his eyes, Aizawa had made it his personal mission to get the kid to laugh at least once a day. It gave him something to focus on, and it ensured that Izuku didn't get completely lost in the darkness that threatened to swallow him. Okay, maybe that was a little dramatic, but seeing Izuku laugh lightened the load on Aizawa's chest significantly. Izuku, however, seemed to have a personal mission of his own. Every night without fail, he would comb through Aizawa's hair with his hands and put it into a braid of some sorts, chatting about heroes or some random species of bird as he did so. This strange act of intimacy came shortly after Izuku's week-long torture stint. Something in the kid seemed to break. He'd wake up every night sobbing, screaming, clutching at his chest, his arms, his neck, reaching to grab his body as if it had been ripped from him in his dreams. Aizawa would rush to his side, not knowing how to help but moved into action, cradling Izuku in his arms until the sobbing stopped and the tears slowed. Izuku would run his hands through Aizawa's hair without realizing at first, and embarrassingly curl into a ball with his face covered when he realized what he had been doing. Aizawa had sighed, a sad smile on his face, as he dropped the kid's hand back on his head. If it helps you calm down, you can touch my hair, problem child. I don't mind. And that was when their tradition began. Afterwards, anytime Izuku had a nightmare, Aizawa would hold him in his arms until he calmed down, and they would sit on the bottom bunk of the bed together, talking in hushed tones as Izuku braided Aizawa's hair with shaky hands. Aizawa would be lying if he said it wasn't nice. He had never let anyone touch his hair before, besides Hizashi's occasional tussle, and it was odd, to say the least. Pleasantly so. It was grounding in the sense that he could feel Izuku's fingers on his scalp, was close enough to hear the boy's heartbeat and slightly uneven breathing. It was confirmation that Izuku was alive, that he was breathing. It helped quell his paranoia, his deep-rooted fear that had been planted when the kid had been dumped back into the cell, barely breathing and so unbearably cold. He didn't like seeing Izuku in pain, but it was better than the alternative. So that was how they spent their days. Scheming, training, talking, constantly soaking up each other's presence, forming a bond only a fool would try to break. It was comfortable and almost domestic in a sense. They were still in a literal prison cell. Aizawa still desperately missed his husband, his job, and his cats, even BSTRD. Izuku still struggled with his healing wounds, his unsteady mind. They both had days where getting out of bed seemed impossible and escaping seemed like a faraway dream. They both got quiet sometimes, pausing to think about what was happening in the outside world right now, how much they were missing, if anyone was missing them. Aizawa wondered sometimes, when Izuku was asleep and the room was just too quiet, if his husband was looking for him, or if Hisashi thought he was dead. The thought kept him up at night. But when all of that was put aside, Izuku and Aizawa managed to find comfort in each other. The past month hadn't been horrible, in Aizawa's opinion. The torture had stopped, and he and the kid were making things work in their own messy, jumbled way of surviving. Everything was manageable. Stable at the very least. It should have been a warning, there's always calm before a storm. When Izuku awoke, it was to sore muscles and an aching body. This wasn't unusual, since Aizawa had been pushing him harder in training, but it wasn't very pleasant. He sighed, pushing himself up into a sitting position on his bed to begin the day. Looking over to his right, Izuku was ready to tease Aizawa about his inevitable bedhead. But Aizawa wasn't there. Izuku's heart dropped in his chest. Something wasn't right. Aizawa was always in the same spot when he woke up. The man had stubbornly refused to sleep on the top bunk, muttering something about constant vigilance, before moving the flimsy mattress to sit between Izuku and the metal door. Now, though, the mattress was empty. Izuku scrambled out of bed, looking frantically around the room for any sign of the underground hero, but finding none. Which only meant one thing. Aizawa was gone. Taken. Izuku's breathing picked up, his heart pounding in his ears. Gone, he was gone. It felt like there was static running through his veins, as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning, the room losing focus by the second. Squeezing his eyes shut, Izuku tried to control his breathing. In for 5 seconds, hold for 6, out for 7. 5, 6, 7. Just like Aizawa had taught him. He repeated this process until his heart rate had finally steadied, his head clearer than it had been before. Now wasn't the time for panicking, Izuku reminded himself, trying to get his mind in order. He needed to think. Aizawa was gone, taken somewhere, and Izuku didn't know where he was. That alone wasn't completely unusual. The doctor had been taking Aizawa for more visits lately and returning him later and later. What was unusual was when they did this. Aizawa was taken while Izuku was asleep. That had never happened before, in however many months they had been there. Questions swarmed Izuku's head, insisting and unceasing. Why when Izuku was asleep? How did they take him without waking Izuku up? Surely the noise would have been enough to wake him, so did they drag him to keep him asleep? Why was this time different? Did the time that they took him hold any significance, or was it just random? Was this some type of psychological torture for Izuku? Were they torturing Aizawa? Izuku had begun muttering while trying to sort through his thoughts, the sound filling the quiet room as he paced back and forth. Why had the doctor been so focused on Aizawa recently? Sure, they already had done plenty of testing on Izuku, but he hadn't been taken for an examination since his meeting with Overhaul. There had to be a reason. Were they doing the same thing to Aizawa that they had done to Izuku? He hoped not. His mind kept drifting back to the peculiarity of the situation. Why did they take Aizawa when they did? The doctor was seemingly always here, so it wasn't an issue with his schedule at least. So why the odd timing? Or the better question, whose time were they operating on now? The thought stopped Izuku in his tracks. Of course. He knew why. He didn't want it to be true, but it was the only thing that made any fragment of sense in this twisted situation. Aizawa was going to meet Overhaul. And Izuku needed to do something quick. When Aizawa Shoyuda opened his eyes, he immediately noticed that he wasn't where he was supposed to be. Instead of lying on a flimsy mattress on the ground of his cell, he was strapped to a metal chair. Or a table? It was more like a sheet of metal, almost like the planks used by knife throwers for their volunteers in those old American TV shows Hisashi always made him watch. His arms and legs were strapped tight against his body with thick leather bands, a similar one pinning down his waist, his torso, and his head. Whoever had taken him was being incredibly thorough. Oddly enough, he wasn't in the doctor's usual office. Looking around the shockingly all-white room, he found no one else present. There were, however, desks in neat rows across the room from him, covered in computers, scattered notes, lab equipment, and so on. The room smelled of antiseptic, like it had been cleaned recently. It was unsettlingly quiet, the only noise being the faint whirring of machinery. Aizawa tried to wiggle his arms and legs to see how tightly he was really stuck, and he barely budged an inch. He could feel the beginning of a headache coming on. He wondered how they even got him here. He didn't remember being taken. He would have put up a fight, especially since, if his last memory proved correct, the kid was asleep. He was never taken when the kid was sleeping. Nor would he ever leave the kid without trying to wake him up first. Aizawa wouldn't let him wake up to an empty room. The thought alone had Aizawa shivering. He remembered the feeling of waking up and Izuku being gone, not returning for hours. It was horrible. He could only hope to be reunited with him soon, for both of their sakes. Aizawa was pulled out of his musings by several high-pitched beeping noises followed by a resounding metallic click. The thick metal door at the far side of the room swung open. That alone was strange to Aizawa. Why the intense security measures? What was so important that it needed to be kept under such heavy-duty locks? As the answer to his questions walked through the door, Aizawa bit back a curse. It all made sense now. Why Izuku had been so frightened after returning to the cell a month ago, why he was so terrified he couldn't even talk about what they had done to him. The wounds covering his body, too thin and precise to have been made by hand. It was like he had been torn apart from the inside out with a quirk, then shoved back together again. The reality of the situation hit Aizawa like a sack of bricks. Because in walked Chisaki Kai, better known as Overhaul, the leader of the 8 Precepts of Death. Aizawa had been investigating the man for years because of his involvement with the Yakuza, an organized crime syndicate running rampant throughout Japan. Overhaul was actually the name of his quirk. He could disassemble anything he touches and put it back together again. He was a suspect in dozens of murder cases and had charges ranging from manslaughter to arson to serial kidnapping. Other than his quirk, a list of charges, and some witness descriptions, the police force had next to no information on him. But the descriptions the witnesses provided were always the same. Green jacket with purple fur, and a giant bird beak plague mask. He was an eccentric figure, one you couldn't mistake. Aizawa had never met the man before, but he knew from the second he locked eyes with him that this really was Overhaul. His eyes were those of a killer, and Aizawa's instincts were screaming at him to run far, far away. His instincts were never wrong. The man entered the room slowly, his gaze fixed on Aizawa. His eyes were full of disapproval? Malice? Aizawa wasn't sure, but whatever it wasn't good. His cold aura washed over the room like a winter chill, and Aizawa had never missed the warm comfort of his capture weapon more than he did right now. Hiding his fear, his panic, Aizawa returned Overhaul's glare with one of his own, vicious and biting. He could feel himself slip into his underground mode, his vision sharpening, his walls raising. Aizawa knew how vital it was to separate his emotions from his ability to make logical decisions, to keep a cool head. He didn't have the luxury of feeling anything right now. As much as he wanted to scream at the BSDRD for hurting his kid, he had to gain the upper hand in the situation, if at all possible. Overhaul, how chic to finally meet you. You look like even more of a scumbag than I was expecting. Aizawa's flat tone gave nothing away, his gaze dismissive and bored. It was a risky move, but the only thing he could think of, a smart mouth and arrogant attitude set villains off to no end. And the angrier someone was, the more likely they were to make a mistake. It showed that Aizawa wasn't scared, wasn't someone who could be controlled, even if he was absolutely terrified. Which he definitely wasn't. Not at all. Show you to Aizawa, the displeasure is all mine. I've been waiting to meet you for months, but sadly my schedule has been quite busy. The man's words were clipped, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Aizawa as if he were a rotting animal, collecting flies on the side of the road. Oh, well, thank you so much for gracing me with your presence. It means the world to finally meet a sickly Victorian peasant in the flesh. It was on my bucket list, you know. Overhaul's eyes darkened. Such a filthy, disgusting mouth. Soon, this world will be clean of filth. You're going to help me achieve that. Talk as much as you want about filth, you're no cleaner than I am. The villain let out a long, extended sigh. You're right about that. Filth is unfortunately unavoidable for quirked individuals. He took a step forward, his shoulders straightening, a strange look overtaking his features that had Aizawa's hair standing on end. He didn't like where this was going. But those without quirks are pure. You know, I've met quite a few quirkless individuals in my days. Old and young, brilliant and foolish. They were all clean, beautifully, wonderfully clean. Yet their minds were delicate and their bodies unsuitable. Like flowers, they wilted when plucked, and their purity died with them. And then young Izuku came into our world, and our prayers were finally answered. Aizawa grit his teeth, trying to contain his emotions. The BSE had tortured the kid to an inch of his life, and still had the audacity to talk about him like he was some sick sacrifice. He said nothing, and Overhaul continued, his voice lighter than before. Ah, yes, Izuku truly is the solution to all of our problems. He was so much nicer to be around than you are, that much is certain. He just has an air about him so innocent, so pure. The second I made eye contact with him, I knew he was something special. Rage pooled in Aizawa's stomach, his blood burning beneath his skin. He stayed quiet, he had to stay quiet. The child was terrified, I know. Trembling even. Like a deer in the headlights, frozen before disaster. His panic was bewitching. But do you know what was even better? Aizawa clenched his fists, tight enough to draw blood. If he weren't tied down, he would have jumped that BSTRD ages ago. He wanted him to stop talking. Overhaul took another step forward. Then another and another, until he stopped about 2 feet away from Aizawa, far too close for his liking. The man's voice was barely above a whisper now, his eyes glinting in delight. Even better were his screams when I ripped his body apart, over and over again. Oh, they were beautiful. Like an angel singing to me from heaven. Even his blood was clean and pure. A growl escaped Aizawa's throat as he lurched forward in his restraints, teeth snapping at Overhaul, face darkened with anger. Shut the F up. Overhaul laughed in his face. It was an ugly sound, almost like a shrieking pelican. It didn't suit the man. So, the cold-hearted Eraserhead has a soft spot for the quirkless child? How peculiar. Although, I don't blame you. Izuku is quite fascinating. His genetic makeup is fundamentally different from you and I's. It made putting him back together quite the challenge. How is he doing, by the way? Is he still in shock? Dying will do that to a person, especially a child. I hope I didn't break him too badly. I need him intact for my research. Aizawa had to fight to keep himself from breaking down entirely. He knew what Overhaul was succeeding to do. Hearing about how Izuku was tortured, how he had been killed, was tearing him apart. You touch him again and I'll rip you to shreds with my bare hands. Aizawa's threat, primal and dangerous, would have had any normal person shaking in their boots. Unfortunately, Overhaul was far from normal. And how do you plan on doing that, HM? You couldn't hurt me even if you wanted to, Eraserhead. You're defenseless. I've already injured your precious boy. I killed him. Again and again and again. You know, he was conscious the entire time. Since I was remaking his brain constantly, he didn't have the ability to pass out. All he could feel was pain, I'm sure. Overhaul leaned back for a moment, observing Aizawa with blazing eyes. Imagine how it felt to be ripped apart like that. Every nerve made fresh, sensitive to any little touch, each cut and tear. With a slow and precise motion, he unbuckled the clasp on his glove. Well, I suppose you won't have to imagine anything. You'll get to know exactly how it felt. Aizawa struggled to breathe, his chest heavy, his pulse frantic. A feeling of suffocating helplessness washed over him like a tsunami, drowning him in depths he knew he couldn't escape from. Overhaul was right. He couldn't do anything. He could only watch as Izuku was hurt again and again. Watch as the light in his kid's eyes faded with every passing day. Watch as the doctor performed his relentless examinations. Watch as Overhaul reached forward with an unloved hand and ripped Aizawa apart. Taking apart a human body and putting it back together in the span of a few seconds was a delicate, yet messy business. Overhaul enjoyed inflicting pain, of course, but he quite disliked how filthy things often got in the process. Blood stained the floor, bits of flesh and bones and fat disintegrating beneath his very touch. There was screaming and crying in silence, and then more screaming and crying. It got old quickly. But Overhaul didn't dirty his hands for nothing. by understanding, deconstructing, and reconstructing Eraserhead's physical form, he was able to locate, segregate, and pick apart the man's quirk factor. Overhaul rebuilt Eraserhead again, searching for the right piece, the part of his quirk that would be transferable to his research. The lab's door flung open, and Overhaul's concentration was broken. A technician staggered forward, his face red and his breathing labored. "Sir, I'm sorry to disrupt you, but there's been a disturbance." Slowly, Overhaul turned away from his work to face the man that had disrupted him. The room fell deathly quiet. What could be so important to warrant such an interruption? His voice rang out. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. The scientist grew pale, his eyes wide. It's 13-9B, sir," the man stuttered. "He's engaged in a standoff with the doctor, code red. He's demanding that Eraserhead is returned to the cell." Overhaul was quiet for a moment, considering his options. He looked to Eraserhead, now covered in blood, thin wounds swirling their way around the entirety of his body. It was a disgusting sight. It wasn't ideal, but he supposed he'd gotten enough data already. Besides, he had other matters to attend to. Get Eraserhead cleaned and bandaged. In the meantime, I'll pay the boy a visit myself. The scientist nodded furiously, too scared to speak, before leaving to find another set of hands to help with his work. Wiping the blood from his hands, Overhaul put his glove back on, snapping the buckle into place. He refused to be covered in blood while in the presence of a child, after all. It was just inconsiderate. Izuku wasn't sure what he was doing. Really, he had no idea where this plan had come from. He blamed Aizawa's bad influence. And Katsuki. Both had instilled in him a sense of bravery and rebelliousness that he didn't seem to have previously. Aizawa's presence and training had given him confidence, while Izuku's memories of Katsuki provided him with the inspiration. Inspiration for what? Well, the inspiration to make a scene, of course. But was one thing Katsuki had taught Izuku, it was how to get all eyes on him, whether it be for better or for worse. And so, that was how Izuku found himself in his current predicament. When he had woken up to an empty cell, Izuku had panicked. He knew, logically, that Aizawa was being tortured, most likely by Overhaul. He couldn't just sit by and let that happen, he had to do something. If their attention was on him instead of Aizawa, it meant that he wouldn't get hurt as badly. Hypothetically, at least. So Izuku made a scene. First, he looked for a weapon. Something sharp or blunt, anything he could hurt himself or someone else with. Everything in the room was bolted to the floor, so that left Izuku with very few options. The only items not bolted to the floor were the ratty blankets and pillows on the bed, the bar of soap on the sink, and the paper and crayons scattered around the floor. He could always draw Overhaul a nice little picture. The man would probably stop murdering his hero and play a fun game of tic-tac-toe with Izuku instead. Yeah, not likely. He needed something jagged, something that could actually hurt someone, but there was nothing in the room he could even break to get that. The light bulb flickered above him, catching his attention. Izuku took a closer look at the metal cage surrounding it. He wouldn't be able to remove them, but they were thin and far enough apart that something could slip through. Something small and easy to throw, but heavy enough to break the bulb. Like a bar of soap, for example. Throwing the bar of soap hard enough and accurately enough to actually break the light bulb proved to be rather difficult, but after about a dozen failed attempts, Izuku finally succeeded. Broken glass rained down to the floor, fragments falling around him. He jumped out of the way to avoid them, picking through the pieces once everything had settled. By luck alone was he able to find a rather large shard with a sharp tip, sharp enough to do some actual damage. After sweeping the rest of the broken glass under the bed with one of the blankets, he really didn't want to step on them and not be able to walk. He moved on to the next step of his plan. Izuku grasped the shard tightly in his left hand, approaching the metal door of his cell with purpose. He took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for what he was about to do next. Pulling back his right fist, he began vigorously banging his hand against the metal door, a resounding thud ringing out with every hit. As he did so, he screamed as loud as he could, voice echoing in the previously quiet cell. To say it was loud was an understatement. The banging on the door alone would have been enough to draw attention, but Izuku had some serious pipes. He wailed like a banshee, waiting for someone to come down to find the cause of the commotion. Within minutes, he could hear the rattling of the lock from the door in front of him, someone cursing on the other side of the metal. It quickly retreated to the far side of the room, still screaming, waiting for the door to swing open. It was guard number 3 who walked in next, the same one who had dragged Izuku up to Aizawa's first examination. His bald head shone with sweat, eyes wide and dangerous. He was said, "What the hell is going on in here?" the man practically growled, a bulging vein pulsing on his neck. Izuku swallowed the fear that tightened his throat, struggling to keep his voice from shaking. "Bring the doctor down right now or else." His wide green eyes met the dark brown of the guard, who proceeded to snort loudly across the room, crossing his muscular arms across his chest. "Or what, pipsqueak? You gonna cry?" Instead of responding, Izuku raised the glass fragment up to his throat, its sharp end resting right against his skin. He was struck with a sudden sense of déjà vu, and resisted the urge to laugh. The guard's face fell, any previous amusement far gone. He started moving towards Izuku, stopping when the boy spoke, his free hand extended in warning. "I wouldn't come any closer if I were you. Unless you want to explain to your boss why his test subject bled out under your watch," Izuku said confidently, sweat trickling down the back of his neck. He was more grateful now than ever for Aizawa's lessons in manipulation and deceit. Glaring at Izuku, his mouth pressed together in a tight line, the guard hesitated. He stood still for a moment, as if trying to assess the validity of Izuku's threat. His eyes flitted between the glass and Izuku's face, hand twitching towards the taser strapped to his belt. Izuku pressed the shard into his throat harder, unflinching as beads of crimson dripped down his neck. The guard froze. "Call your boss," Izuku snarled, "or I slit my throat. Choice is yours, but I suggest you choose quickly." His heart was pounding against his chest, his blood almost buzzing in his veins. It had to work. It had to. "Wait. Okay, just don't do anything stupid," the guard snapped, reaching carefully to the walkie-talkie on the other side of his belt, telegraphing his movements clearly. Pressing the device's largest button, he spoke in a low, gruff voice. "Doc, I need you down in the cell ASAP. Patient 13-9B is threatening suicide." He managed to break the light bulb and is armed with a piece of glass. "I repeat, I need you down in the cell ASAP." All while the guard sent his message, Izuku only returned his angry glare, trying to keep his hand from shaking. His stomach churned with a combination of fear and exhilaration, glad that his plan was working but terrified of the fallout, the consequences of his actions. He only hoped that it would be enough to save Aizawa from Overhaul's quirk, even for a few minutes. The doctor didn't respond through the walkie-talkie. Instead, barely 2 minutes after the guard had messaged him, pounding footsteps could be heard racing to the cell's entrance. The doctor, disheveled and breathing hard, practically flew. Inside the room, stopping suddenly when he saw the position Izuku was in. Anger and annoyance could be seen on his face, followed by a fleeting look of fear? Desperation? Izuku wasn't sure. Although he would be lying if he said that seeing the doctor so frazzled wasn't exhilarating. The man tried to take a step forward, but backed up quickly when Izuku raised his hand further, still digging into his throat. The doctor held up his hands, his palms facing Izuku in a placating gesture. Really, Izuku had to stop ending up in these situations. "Now, boy, we don't want to do anything rash. Why don't you put that down?" He gave a tense smile, eyes fixated on the weapon at Izuku's neck. Izuku could see him swallow nervously, could see his hands trembling every few seconds. It gave him confidence, quelled some of the fear weighing on his chest. "I'm not your boy. And I'll stop when Eraserhead is brought back." Izuku growled, trying to replicate the tone Katsuki always used when he was mad, the one that inspired panic to anyone on its receiving end. At this, the doctor paled. He lowered his hands slightly, feet shuffling forward. "Now, doctor, I don't think you understand the situation you're in." The familiar words made the man's eyes widen in indignation. I said. Izuku's gaze met the doctor's, his resolve unwavering. "Bring Eraserhead back." The doctor grit his teeth, his eyes falling once again to the glass shard piercing Izuku's neck. The cell was quiet as the man thought about what to do, trying to find a way out of the situation but clearly finding none. After a moment's pause, he turned to guard number 3, his voice clipped and full of dread. "Notify Overhaul. Bring Eraserhead down here." The guard nodded, making his way quickly out of the cell to complete his orders. Izuku could have collapsed in relief. Aizawa was going to be okay. He had to be okay. Then he thought about the implications of what he had just done. Overhaul was probably on his way down here. And he was not going to be happy, that much was sure. Izuku shuddered just thinking about the man. The last thing he wanted was to see him again. There was something about the way he had looked at Izuku, it was unnerving. Like he was a piece of treasure, something to be cherished, similar to the way a child looks at a Christmas present, except far, far more disturbing. Caught in his musings, Izuku almost didn't notice the doctor creeping slowly towards him. His head shot up, eyes blazing, as he pressed the shard of glass into his throat harder, the flow of blood down his neck that had previously slowed now picking back up. "I don't think Overhaul would like it if I died. Wouldn't you agree, Doctor?" Izuku's voice was cold and calculating. He'd analyzed both Overhaul and the doctor's quirks. He was 98% sure that the doctor couldn't revive people, and that Overhaul could undo damage he did, but not what others inflicted. Judging by the doctor's alarm, he had a feeling he was correct. Honestly, Izuku wasn't sure how he was staying this calm. It seemed like his lessons with Aizawa were paying off. And so, the two stood silently, poised in a dangerous showdown until Overhaul arrived. It was the longest 15 minutes of Izuku's life. His arm shook with the strain of being held up for that long, so much so that he had to focus on not actually slitting his throat. The doctor never took his eyes off of him, obviously worried that he would slip up. Izuku almost wondered why the doctor was so panicked, but after watching his interaction with Overhaul, it made sense. If Izuku died on his watch, the doctor would be ripped to shreds. It would not be pleasant, that much was certain. After waiting for what felt like hours, it was around 20 minutes, a set of footsteps could be heard approaching the cell, the slow and meticulous gait accentuated by metallic shoes clicking on the stone floor. Izuku tightened his grip on the shard of glass, his heart rate spiking. The footsteps drew closer and closer, until finally, Overhaul's tall figure entered the cell. His expression unreadable, the man approached the pair, stopping next to the doctor. His gaze swept Izuku up and down, and Izuku fought the urge to scream under the intense focus. "Well, you've certainly landed yourself in quite the predicament, huh, Izu?" Overhaul drew out the syllables of the boy's name almost playfully, and it made Izuku shiver in disgust. It was the first time the man had actually said his name, and Izuku hated how it sounded coming from his mouth. He grit his teeth, glaring at Overhaul, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response just yet. Overhaul's gaze stuck on Izuku for another moment before turning to the doctor, his eyes blazing with fury. "And you?" At this, the doctor stiffened. "I'm still not pleased about your previous misstep. Go fetch Eraserhead with the others and bring him down here. Do it quickly and I'll consider lessening your punishment." Overhaul's voice was disinterested, detached, and cold, but his presence was dangerous. The doctor nodded, swallowing thickly. "Yes, sir," he stuttered, before scampering outside of the cell, rushing to distance himself from the terrifying figure that was Overhaul. It was almost funny. Almost. Now, it was just Overhaul and Izuku in the cell. The panic and fear Izuku had been ignoring previously reared its ugly head and was burning a hole in Izuku's stomach. With a steady hand, Overhaul unclasped the glove on his right hand, taking it off. And he took a step forward. It took every ounce of restraint Izuku possessed to not take a step back. Instead, he tightened his grip on the shard of glass at his throat, eyes widening in warning. "IW wouldn't do that." Izuku inwardly cringed at the break in his voice. He couldn't help his trembling now. Overhaul only tilted his head slightly, almost curiously, at the gesture. He took another step forward. Under his foot, something cracked, sharp and loud in the silence of the cell. Both he and Izuku froze. Slowly, Overhaul moved his boot to the side, revealing a broken crayon. The man leaned down to pick up the two halves, holding it carefully between his fingers. As Izuku watched, The crayon seemed to almost bubble, warping horribly before it exploded into pieces. Dust, really. He knew it was some type of terrible intimidation tactic, but Izuku couldn't help but flinch. Overhaul stepped forward again. This time, Izuku stepped back. His shoulder blades hit the stone wall behind him, chest heaving with panic as he tried to swallow the lump in his throat. He steeled himself, readjusting the shard of glass until it sat right on top of his jugular vein, waiting. Overhaul paused at the action, seeming to think. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice uncharacteristically soft. It wasn't warm, but it was quiet, considering. You really would, wouldn't you? Overhaul's darkened eyes bored into his soul, and Izuku's breath faltered at the question. He fought the tears that were threatening to spill down his cheeks, gritting his teeth. You were hurting him. Izuku's voice broke again, the confidence that had previously possessed him now gone. He was scared. Terrified. He didn't know what else to do, he had to do something. You were hurting Zawa. Tears streamed down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't look away, too scared that Overhaul would pounce in his moment of weakness. The room fell silent as Overhaul observed him, just watching. Slowly, with a care that Izuku didn't know what to do with, Overhaul knelt down in front of Izuku, eye to eye with the young boy. Izuku scrunched up his face in confusion, hand tightening around the weapon he was holding. Overhaul stared into his eyes for a moment, the air thick with tension, with fear. Izuku waited for Overhaul to do something, to hurt him, to get mad. Instead he spoke. I wonder if you know of the power you hold. And that wasn't what Izuku was expecting. He froze, his grip on the shard of glass loosening ever so slightly as he turned the words over in his head, trying to understand. Overhaul was still looking at him with those unreadable eyes, as if he was seeing something Izuku couldn't. But, I'm quirkless? The words slipped out before Izuku could stop himself. For all he knew, this was just an attempt to get him to drop his guard, for Overhaul to tear him apart. But he was scared and confused and it didn't make any sense. The man's face twisted, his eyes narrowing and his cheeks moving. With a start, Izuku realized that Overhaul was smiling under the mask, his eyes alight with excitement. The sight made Izuku's skin crawl. Exactly. Izuku didn't like any of this, he didn't like what Overhaul was saying or how he was looking at him or how close he was. The sound of footsteps echoed throughout the cell, approaching them quickly. Overhaul stood back up, his face returning to the cold, emotionless mask he usually wore, and the moment was broken. Guard number 3, accompanied by the doctor, entered the cell. In the guard's arms was an unconscious Aizawa, covered in white bandages that were spotted with red. Izuku had never seen the man look so small, so defenseless. It made his heart drop in his chest, his mouth falling open in a silent gasp. The guard made his way over to the bed carefully, paying close attention to Izuku as he dropped Aizawa unceremoniously onto the bottom bunk. Izuku fought the urge to rush to the hero's side, but he relaxed slightly knowing that at least Aizawa wasn't being hurt right now. He tried not to think about what had happened before, what he had failed to prevent. Guilt ate away at his stomach as he shoved those thoughts away for another time. He wasn't out of the clear just yet. Overhaul returned his gaze to Izuku, any remnants of his past fondness long gone. Consider yourself lucky, child, he sneered, the tone enough to make Izuku's blood run cold. Without another glance at him, Overhaul began walking out of the room. Get this mess cleaned up, he called out to his subordinates as he disappeared around the corner. Only when Izuku couldn't hear the man's receding footsteps did he allow himself to breathe, his heartbeat slowing down considerably. The doctor fixed his gaze on Izuku, the previous panic that had occupied his features now gone, a tired and angry look in its place. Noting the shard of glass still at the boy's throat, the doctor sighed deeply, reaching into a pocket of his lab coat and retrieving a small cylindrical object that Izuku didn't recognize. Looking now at the guard, the doctor nodded. Without a single word uttered between them, both figures turned around and walked right out of the cell, the metal door clanging shut behind them. Izuku stood there in shock. Looking around, bewildered, it took a few moments for Izuku to finally drop the shard of glass at his throat and rush to Aizawa's side. He sighed in relief as he felt a strong and steady pulse from the man's wrist. Kneeling on the ground next to the bed, ignoring the shards of glass embedding themselves in his skin, Izuku moved Aizawa into a more comfortable position, sliding the flimsy pillow underneath his head and covering the man with the other ratty blanket. The adrenaline was slowly leaving Izuku's system, and he was left shaking like a leaf, tears now streaming steadily down his face. He let his head fall against the mattress, shoulders trembling as he sobbed quietly. He was so exhausted, so absorbed in his relief that Aizawa was alive and breathing and safe, that he failed to notice the small object the doctor had been holding being slid into the room through the small compartment in the bottom of the door, emitting an odorless and colorless gas. Izuku could feel his eyelids grow heavier, his attempts at staying vigilant becoming more difficult by the second. He was just so glad that Aizawa was here, was safe. And he was tired. So tired. His breathing evened out, body slumping against the mattress as he fell into a dreamless sleep. The room was quiet once more, almost peaceful. The sleeping gas dissipated quickly, and soon enough, two familiar figures stepped into the cell. The doctor's associates, the women that had bathed and cleaned Izuku, regarded the room with silent consideration. Eraserhead was unconscious on the bottom bunk's mattress, and Izuku was collapsed against him, still kneeling on the ground, also unconscious. The floor was covered with shattered glass, haphazardly swept to the side by a discarded blanket. The two women worked in silence, sweeping up the glass, removing anything not bolted to the floor, leaving the mattresses and the blanket that wasn't covered in glass, and eventually lugging in a fresh mattress to position next to the bottom bunk. The previous mattress had shards of broken glass in its seams and needed to be removed. Carefully, the women maneuvered Izuku into a sitting position, cleaning the wound on his neck and removing the tiny pieces of glass that had embedded themselves in the boy's knees. That he has a chance, you know. With the hero, the younger of the two women muttered, looking at the boy carefully as she bandaged his neck. The older woman froze for just a moment before putting new sheets on the mattress, not responding. "Kurai, we could do something this time." "Lower your voice," she finally replied, whispering at her partner angrily. "What do you want to do? Call the heroes? Take out Overhaul? I don't like any of this either, but I'm not naive enough to think that we could actually save this boy. You heard what they have planned for the man. Which is exactly why we have to help. Just think about it, please. I can't bury another one of them. Please." The two women looked at each other silent, angry, scared, before turning their eyes downward. Kurai placed Izuku on the new mattress, his injuries freshly bandaged, her gaze catching on his sleeping face. He was so tiny, so young. No more words were spoken between them. They had said all that needed to be said. For now, at least. After the room was fully cleaned and the light bulb replaced, covered completely this time with an unbreakable see-through shield, the two women left, with neither Izuku nor Aizawa any the wiser of their quiet visitors. When Aizawa had finally woken up after his meeting with Overhaul, Izuku broke down crying. He tried so hard not to. Aizawa needed support, not a sobbing child to take care of. But try as he might, he couldn't hold back his tears when dull, dark eyes met his worried gaze. Like a pool of spilt ink, they were a seemingly endless chasm of pitch black, devoid of emotion, of life. Izuku pulled Aizawa into a loose hug, wary of his injuries, after he had helped him into a sitting position. He had never seen the man like this, had never seen anyone like this. Breathing but lifeless. Aizawa was a shell of a person. He wasn't responding to Izuku's questions or touches, seemingly unaware that Izuku was even present. As he cried, Izuku talked to Aizawa. The boy was no stranger to dissociation. He remembered, in the months before Aizawa arrived, the state of emptiness that he'd slip into after every session with the doctor. The world would fade into the background, and everything would feel so far away. He'd be aware of everything going on around him, but couldn't seem to bring himself to break out of that fuzzy state of mind. He figured that was what Aizawa was going through right now. Most likely, it was his brain's way of coping with what Overhaul had put him through. So, Izuku cried. He cried and he held his hero. He braided his hair and whispered to him about heroes and cats and his favorite segments on Present Mix radio show. He rambled on about anything his brain could latch onto. Unfortunately for Aizawa, who Izuku wasn't sure could even hear him, Izuku had a plethora of knowledge on microeconomics, mechanical engineering, and foreign policy. It made for some very dry filler. Honestly, Izuku was just scared of the silence. He was worried that if he were to stop talking, Aizawa would slip deeper into the darkness and never return. So Izuku talked, sniffling between sentences, sitting with Aizawa in the dimly lit room, trying not to completely lose his mind. It took almost 2 hours for Aizawa to break out of his state of dissociation. As Izuku was talking about vertical integration, he was seriously running out of things to talk about. He could feel Aizawa stir slightly beside him. Izuku stopped talking. He was still positioned next to Aizawa, having moved to share the bunk bed mattress with him so he could support his weight and make sure he didn't strain his injuries. He moved to retract his arm from the man's shoulders now that he seemed to be coming to, but a trembling hand stopped him in the process. Zawa? Can you hear me? Izuku's voice kept breaking, fear and worry evident in his tone. He studied Aizawa's face closely. His eyes held more life in them than before, although he didn't seem to be very aware of his surroundings. Kid! Aizawa's voice was barely a croak. It wasn't the usual gruff, stoic voice that Izuku had come to associate with the underground hero. That one word was full of vulnerability, spoken quietly and despondently, as if worried that Izuku was merely a figment of his imagination. It tore Izuku's heart to pieces to hear the man so utterly broken. I'm here, Zawa. Izuku stifled back a sob. I'm here. He pulled Aizawa closer, practically cradling the man in his arms as they both sat on the flimsy mattress, sorrow thick and heavy in the air. Izuku just held his hero as Aizawa's shoulders trembled. He didn't say anything when he felt teardrops land on his skin, soaking into the cloth of his shirt. He didn't say anything to discourage Aizawa's grip on his forearm, a wavering hold that screamed, "Don't leave me." He didn't ask about what had happened or if Aizawa was okay. Instead, he sat quietly, arms circled around Aizawa in a protective embrace as the man cried. Aizawa had always been Izuku's knight, his hero. But his armor had been stripped and his shield had been destroyed. He had seen war and it had shattered him. He had nothing to protect him now, no shield to brandish and no horse to ride into battle. Izuku vowed to be his armor tonight. He promised to hold him, to protect him. He couldn't rebuild the fortress that Aizawa Shoyuda had so carefully constructed, but he could stand guard while the man picked up the pieces. It took a long time for Aizawa to return back to his normal state of self. Neither he nor Izuku spoke of that day while the man recovered, letting the topic rest until he was feeling better. After 2 weeks, it was finally brought up. You did what? Aizawa was using his teacher voice, sharp and cold. It demanded attention, respect. He'd never used it with Izuku before, but it came naturally after what Izuku had just told him. Aizawa had been wondering this entire time why Overhaul had left so suddenly, why he had been returned to the cell early. Izuku would always dodge his questions, but Aizawa didn't let him skip out on answering this time. The kid flinched at the accusing tone, seemingly already regretting telling Aizawa what happened. I woke up and you were gone, Zawa, and I knew that they had taken you, that it had to be Overhaul, and I was so scared and I didn't want them to hurt you because I know what it feels like and it worked. They stopped hurting you. Izuku's voice was shaking and his eyes were watery, but he met Aizawa's calculating gaze, his face set and fists clenched. Aizawa had seen the same look on the faces of his students more times than he could count, the look of a person whose reckless self-sacrifice had been praised in the past, had maybe even saved lives. But that kind of behavior got students and heroes alike killed. It was unacceptable, and Aizawa wouldn't allow Izuku to think that it was okay. So you decide to draw the attention of a criminal mastermind, a literal murderer, instead? By threatening to kill yourself. Is that it? Did I get that part right? Aizawa's voice was still quiet, but pointed. He didn't need to yell to get his message across. That's not. Izuku scrunched up his face, his cheeks red and his eyes puffy, his mouth opening a few times but no words coming out. That I knew they wouldn't kill me, they need me. It was the only leverage I had, Zoa. I know it was risky, but it was worth it. You're safe, and Overhaul left, and he didn't come back. Dark eyes peered up at Aizawa pleadingly, now spilling over with tears. Aizawa's glare softened ever so slightly, but he relented. Izuku, he could have hurt you. Hell, he could have killed you. That man is unstable and incredibly quick to anger. Your life is important, kid. I appreciate you trying to look out for me, but this isn't the way to do it. Izuku seemed to only cry harder at this, his brows furrowed in frustration. It was a startling sight. In all the time that Aizawa had known the boy, he'd never seen Izuku like this. Almost angry. But how else do I stop them from hurting you? It worked. You're right, my life is important to them. Which means they're not going to kill me, and so I'm going to stop you right there. Izuku clamped his mouth shut at Aizawa's interjection, the room falling quiet. Aizawa didn't want to snap at the kid, but he knew it was the only way to get through to him right now. And he had to get through to him. Under no circumstance will you ever try something like that again. Got it? Izuku opened his mouth to protest, but was cut off once again. No, you don't get to refuse, Izuku. You're still a child. I won't have you put yourself in harm's way for my sake. I'm a hero, this is my job. I'm not going to ask again. Do you understand? A moment passed in silence before Izuku turned his eyes to the floor, his tears dripping onto the stone. Yes, I understand. Aizawa closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Kid, look, I'm not mad at you. At that, Izuku's head shot up. You're not. Sighing, Aizawa ran a hand through his hair, guilt pooling in his stomach. Maybe he had been too harsh. He just needed Izuku to be safe, that was all. He couldn't encourage his behavior, not when it could have gotten him killed. No. I'm upset, but I'm not mad at you. Listen, I don't want you hurting yourself or risking your life for me. It's dangerous. I don't want to lose you, kid. Aizawa's shoulders slumped, the exhaustion of the past few weeks finally catching up to him. Izuku looked at him for a moment, blinking, almost as if he were surprised. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I just wanted to help, he sniffled, scrubbing the tears from his cheeks with the back of his hand. I know, kid. You don't have to apologize, it's not your fault we're in this mess. Just be careful, okay? Aizawa didn't try to cover up the break in his voice, didn't try to hide the concern in his eyes. He wasn't sure he could right now anyways. Nodding, Izuku launched himself forwards into his arms, snuggling his head into the crook of Aizawa's neck. His tiny, scarred hands wrapped around the man's shoulders, holding onto him tightly. Aizawa just chuckled, now used to Izuku's constant hugging. He patted the kid's head, returning his embrace warmly. Aizawa waited until Izuku pulled away, his cheeks flushed, looking like he wanted to apologize. Aizawa was trying to train that habit out of him, but staying silent. If the kid needed a hug, he was going to get a hug that Aizawa was never going to accept an apology for. Now come on, how about we train for a little? Really? Can we work on our roundhouse kicks today? I've been trying to get them down, but I can't seem to get my legs to work how they should. Izuku rambled, his eyes alight and his hands waving around with every few words Aizawa thought about before. Izuku had looked surprised when he had reprimanded him, surprised that he would care as if Aizawa was the first in his life to do so. He wanted to ask who had taught him that he was so indispensable, but he knew better than to push even further than he already had, for today at least. It was infuriating that Izuku was so quick to put himself in danger, and even more terrifying that Izuku didn't understand why it was so wrong. Aizawa only hoped that, with time, he could instill a sense of self-worth into the kid. Being in a prison cell wasn't helping. Neither was the torture or the lack of human contact, or the murderer hovering over their shoulders. The list went on. He shook his head to clear it, trying to refocus on Izuku, who was still talking. He had promised to train the kid after all. And so, the pair trained. Izuku had since progressed from the basics and was now learning more offensive maneuvers. Honestly, Aizawa was impressed with how quickly he was able to pick up on things. When he first started instructing Izuku, about a month and a half prior, Izuku could barely last 30 seconds before being knocked flat on his butt while sparring. Now, he could last a solid few minutes against Aizawa. He was no pro, that was undeniable, but his skill wasn't to be underestimated. Since Overhaul had last visited, Izuku and Aizawa were left untouched by the doctor. The only sign that the facility hadn't been completely abandoned was the food still being slid under their cell door twice a day during that stretch of time. It was odd, unsettling. Something was going to happen, and Aizawa wasn't sure what. But they didn't take the time for granted. He and Izuku used it to grow stronger, to train, and to plan. As it was, the plan was still in its beginning stages. There were simply so many unknowns. Aizawa figured that if he could get past the guards and avoid Overhaul, he would be in the clear. The doctor couldn't really do much in a fight. His quirk wasn't combat-based, and the man was pretty scrawny. The guards, however, proved more difficult. They were almost the size of All Might, packed with muscle and built like brick walls. If he had to fight them, quirk or no, Aizawa wasn't sure he could win. That didn't even account for Overhaul or the facility itself. Without a map, there was no way escaping was possible. Unless they could find a phone and call for backup, there wasn't much that could be done. That didn't stop Izuku and Aizawa from planning. Ideas to get more information were constantly sprung back and forth, as well as possible escape routes, vents, windows, sewers, and so on. All they needed was to bide their time wisely and hope that they weren't killed before they could get out. It wasn't a pleasant thought, but it served to be a decent motivator. Aizawa glanced over idly at Izuku, the boy currently doing some stretches after their sparring session. His skin shone with a thin layer of sweat, his eyes sharp and concentrated. He had seen that look in the eyes of underground heroes and villains. It was a look that could see right through you, eyes that could tear you apart in a single glance. It was never a look he had seen in the eyes of a child. Until now, that is. Sensing somehow that he was being observed, Izuku met Aizawa's stare and smiled. It was bright and genuine, and it knocked the breath from Aizawa's lungs. He could only manage a nod back at the kid, who returned to his stretching. Izuku had changed in the several months that Aizawa had come to know him. He was still small, but he had gained a little muscle from their training. He had also gained far too many scars from his visits with Overhaul and the doctor. His entire body was covered in them, pinkish-white lines swirling around his pale skin, depicting an almost mosaic of agony. His dark green hair was past his shoulders at this point and could be mistaken for black in the dark. His old doe-like eyes were less wide and trusting, now narrowed and darkened in constant suspicion. Freckles still painted his face, but any remnant of baby fat was long gone, replaced with a gauntness that spoke of malnourishment. Although both Izuku and Aizawa were being fed, it was far from enough to support anyone long-term, let alone a growing child. He was going to get the two of them out. He was a hero for FS sake. While he was preparing Izuku to fight, to defend himself, he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Not if everything went according to the plan. The plan that was still a work in progress. Regardless, he was going to protect him. Aizawa swore to himself that he would. But it was taking longer than expected, and honestly, Aizawa was scared. The facility was big, uncharted territory. He didn't know how many enemies he'd have to face to break out, didn't know how to get the quirk suppressant out of his body, didn't know if he'd be able to contact backup or get any weapons or beat Overhaul, and he didn't know if he could save Izuku in time. Izuku used to have so much hope in his eyes, and now? He was far from hopeless, but Aizawa could tell that the kid was getting tired. The light in his eyes only ever grew darker now, and his smiles came slower and less frequently. The boy's kindness never wavered, though. No, Aizawa knew that behind the newly constructed walls of defense the kid had been building was a warm and gentle soul, still yearning to be the hero that no one had ever bothered to be for himself. He could only pray that Izuku would make it out of this with some shred of his spirit intact. Unfortunately for Aizawa Shoyuta, God seemed to have other plans in mind. Aizawa wasn't sure how many months had passed since his kidnapping. He was kidnapped sometime in June, of that he was certain, but without any windows in the cell, he couldn't accurately note when the days began and when they ended. Felt like he had been there for years, even if it couldn't have been more than a matter of months. The days were easier now than they were when he had first been taken. The aching in his chest whenever he would think about his husband and cats had lessened slightly. It never went away, truly, and the fear and helplessness that had consumed him in the beginning was more manageable. Maybe he was adjusting to his surroundings. Or maybe he was just becoming numb. It was hard to say for sure. Of course, that was when the experiments changed. After Izuku and Aizawa had fully recovered from their meetings with Overhaul, they had been mainly left alone by the doctor. There were a few examinations every now and then, but nothing majorly debilitating or scarring. The piece was concerning. It meant that they were working on something, preparing for Aizawa didn't know what. Until today, that is. Normally, Aizawa and Izuku would wake up around the same time. Aizawa always woke up first, and around an hour later, 2 trays of food would be slid under the door for them to eat. This morning, however, no food came. Instead, the door opened fully, revealing the 3 bodyguards that seemed to always accompany the doctor. Aizawa and Izuku were in the middle of signing about a plan for future combat lessons when they stopped abruptly, surprised by the sudden entrance. Aizawa stood quickly from his place on the floor, positioning himself between Izuku and the guards. His body was tense, prepared to spring into action at any moment. Izuku reacted similarly, on his feet instantly in front of the bunk bed and lowered slightly into a fighting stance. No one moved. The guards didn't attack them or anything, they just waited, glaring at them impatiently. Aizawa knew that whatever they had planned was going to be bad. Really bad. He spared a glance at Izuku. The kid was ready to fight, ready to follow Aizawa in whatever he did, wherever he went. It didn't make Aizawa feel better, knowing that he couldn't put Izuku at risk like this. In a fight between him and all 3 guards, Aizawa wasn't sure he'd be able to win, let alone protect Izuku in the process. Sighing, Aizawa relaxed into a less threatening position, nodding at Izuku to do the same. The guards finally approached them, one grabbing Izuku and the other 2 grabbing Aizawa. As they were dragged away, Izuku's gaze met Aizawa's. In his eyes, the hero could see fear. He could also see determination. The kid nodded at Aizawa before turning his gaze back to the hallway they were being pulled down. Somewhat startlingly, Aizawa realized that Izuku had been trying to reassure him. The thought weighed heavily in his mind and on his chest as he was escorted roughly into the doctor's office. The office itself had changed since the last time Aizawa had been in it. Instead of just the 1 observation table, there were now 2. They sat in the room menacingly, a foot's length apart from one another. The feeling of unease in Aizawa's stomach only grew at the sight. This wasn't good. Inside the room, fiddling with some equipment, was the doctor. Donned with his goggles and surgical mask, the man stood tall in the stark white room, an air of anticipation surrounding him. Turning around upon the group's entrance, he gestured at the tables, a smile twisting his features under his mask. "Ah, welcome. Please, take a seat," the doctor chuckled. Aizawa rolled his eyes at the man's sick humor as the 2 guards holding his arms dragged him toward one of the metal tables. Izuku was taken to the table closest to the doctor, which Aizawa instantly disliked. By the look of obvious discomfort on Izuku's face, he didn't like it either. But Aizawa knew that fighting would make things exponentially worse, so he didn't struggle as a guard fastened the leather restraints around his limbs, tightened painfully to prevent any movement. Izuku was subjected to the same treatment, and the room was quiet for a moment, letting Aizawa sort through his thoughts. Being here with Izuku was incredibly nerve-wracking. They had never tortured them together in the same place before, always taking them one at a time previously. He was trying to understand why that was. It just didn't make any sense. Why were they together? Was this some type of psychological torture, some way to break them mentally? Maybe it was another experiment, but on what? Was Overhaul going to make an appearance? Aizawa was pulled out of his musings as the doctor stepped closer to him, a scalpel in his hand. He tried to move to avoid such closeness, but no matter how hard he struggled, the bindings wouldn't give. Without any warning or preparation, the doctor pulled the collar of Aizawa's shirt down, pressing the scalpel against the skin where his neck and collarbone met, a sharp sting accompanying the action. Aizawa clenched his teeth, stifling a hiss. Usually, the doctor talked much more before actually experimenting on them. What the F was going on? There was no evil villain monologue, no sadistic jokes or anything. His confusion only grew when the doctor, still eerily silent, pried the incision open with his hands. Taken by surprise, Aizawa let out a gasp of pain, squeezing his eyes shut at the sensation of fingers wriggling around in his shoulder. Izuku startled beside him at the sound. "Zawa, are you okay?" The doctor laughed, his fingers now poking around the inside of his shoulder as if he were looking for something. Aizawa took a deep breath, trying to not let it show how much it actually hurt. It hurt like a beach. "I'm fine, kid." Aizawa had to grit his teeth from crying out again as the doctor probed deeper into his neck. He strained his body against the bindings, his brain screaming at him to get away. He could feel the doctor's fingers close around something embedded in his shoulder, and, ignoring the burning at the movement, finally realized why the doctor was digging into his neck in the first place. The quirk suppressor, the one they had implanted when Aizawa had been kidnapped. He was taking it out. Aizawa's eyes widened, his mind racing a mile a minute. He swallowed the bile forcing its way up his throat, trying to stay calm. With a sickening noise, the doctor finally managed to pull the quirk-suppressing device from Aizawa's shoulder. It was a small metal lump, coated in blood and entirely unassuming, but the removal had Aizawa's world turning upside down. All at once, he could feel his quirk returning to him, washing over his senses like a tidal wave. He gasped, too overwhelmed to even try and stifle the noise. It was like he was whole again. This entire time, he had felt so unbearably empty. He could always feel his quirk in his body, but it was faded, unreachable. Every time he tried to call upon it, he'd be stopped, and it was maddening. After months without it, he had grown accustomed to not being able to use it. But now, Aizawa could feel the power of his quirk coursing through his bloodstream. Erasure alive at a single thought. Reflexively he activated his quirk. He almost wept at the sensation, his eyes burning and his hair floating around his face. He was so consumed with the feeling that he didn't hear the doctor's satisfied hum, or Izuku's worried, "Zawa." Only after a solid minute of Aizawa having erasure activated, when the stinging of his eyes finally forced him to blink, did he deactivate his quirk and tune back into his surroundings. The elation at having his quirk back was replaced with cold, gut-wrenching fear. Because why else would the doctor give him his quirk back if not to experiment with? Almost as if reading his mind, the all-too-silent doctor spoke up. "I'm sure you're both wondering why you're here. And why I gave dear Eraserhead his quirk back. You see, Overhaul found something very interesting when collecting data on young Izuku, something we're finally ready to explore on this very day." At the mention of Overhaul, both Aizawa and Izuku stiffened. The doctor continued, now pacing the length of the floor, footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise quiet room. "Well, while Izuku is quirkless and therefore does not have a quirk factor, Overhaul detected an interesting presence in the boy's brain. Determining one's quirklessness can be done through observing the lack of an extra toe joint, yes. But deeper examinations presented a minute difference in the brain of a quirkless individual versus that of a quirked. Located in the cerebellum is a cluster of neural pathways that are otherwise absent in the brain of a quirked individual. And in Izuku, this cluster just so happens to be incredibly resilient, stronger than any I've seen before. He paused, speeding up in his tangent, becoming more audibly excited with every word. After digging further, this group serves no apparent purpose. However, we believe them to be a sort of possible quirk transmitter, one that, if presented with a quirk base, could bind to said factor and act as a bridge between the body and the quirk, similarly to how a quirked individual's brain is already wired to do so. The doctor stopped his rant as well as his pacing, choosing instead to walk over to Izuku. Reaching the edge of Izuku's metal observation table, he leant over the side, peering down at Izuku with glistening eyes behind his shining goggles. Izuku could only stare upwards at the man's face, eyes wide in fear and anticipation as he waited for the doctor to continue. "Simply put, my boy," the doctor leaned even closer, barely a few inches away from Izuku's face. The child would have flinched away if possible. "You have the possibility of gaining a quirk." For a horrifying moment, the room was quiet. Aizawa couldn't understand his body was still adjusting to his quirk, and he was a smart man, but science, especially quirk science, was never his strong suit. But Izuku had studied quirks for years. And everything clicked. No, you can't. Izuku was frantic, crying, and Aizawa still was trying to make it make sense, but he didn't know what was going on. What the hell do you mean by that? He raised his voice, struggling against his bindings fruitlessly. He didn't like how scared Izuku sounded, terrified in a way he'd never been before. The doctor just laughed, a short and mirthless "Uch" that had Aizawa almost jumping out of his skin. I guess you'll find out, won't you? While the two captives couldn't see the doctor's ruthless grin, they could hear it in his voice, could hear the satisfaction, the sadistic pleasure he took in their suffering practically oozing out of his tone. Izuku went to warn Aizawa, his voice shaking almost violently. Zawa, he's going to. Now, my boy, why don't you keep quiet, yes? I don't want you spoiling the surprise for our dear hero. Otherwise, I can make this process more painful than it needs to be, if you'd so prefer. The doctor's threat had Izuku snapping his mouth shut, falling silent once more. Aizawa racked his brain frantically, trying to think about what could possibly be happening. In his rant, the doctor was talking about neural pathways? Something quirks? That Izuku was special, but what did that have to do with him? Honestly, he hadn't been paying much attention to the doctor's ramblings, too focused on the fact that his quirk was back, his quirk was back, his quirk was back. He knew that whatever was going to happen next wasn't good, a fact only reinforced by the fear in Izuku's voice. The doctor, now with something in his hands, approached the tables. Aizawa squeezed his eyes shut, fearing the worst. He expected the pain of a scalpel again, the dragging of a blade against his skin. It wouldn't be pleasant, but he would get through it. He had to. But the doctor wasn't working on him. Izuku let out a strangled cry of pain on his left. It was almost more like a scream, starting as a hoarse yelp and turning into a full-throated wail, filled with an agony that made Aizawa's instincts flail to go, help, save. His eyes were wide open now, desperately searching his field of vision but only able to see the horrible white ceiling and, out of the corner of his eye, the doctor's back, obscuring his view of Izuku. Even though he couldn't see him, he could hear him. His kid was screaming, crying, begging. Panic filled every part of his body and he thrashed against his restraints because Izuku was being hurt. The doctor was hurting his kid. Zyukeyu? Izuku! You get your goddamn hands off him, you motherfucking Baal! Aizawa's cries of rage were cut off by a spine-chilling squelching sound, another scream, and the doctor moved his hands just a bit, holding something that Aizawa couldn't identify. He wasn't sure he wanted to in the first place. But the screaming had stopped. The room was filled instead with the sounds of Izuku's choked sobs, his heaving breaths for air. Aizawa was absolutely livid. He was still struggling against the leather straps tying him to the table, growling with increasing aggravation as he made little to no progress. Without realizing, he had activated his quirk again. Tears streamed down his face, but he couldn't feel the sting. He was too consumed by his fear, by his rage. Without even turning around, the doctor sighed, a pleased-sounding noise that only served to fuel Aizawa's fury. Now, Eraser. I ask that you calm down. Otherwise, your commotion may cause me to slip and hurt the boy even more. We don't want that now, do we? Gritting his teeth to try and steady himself, Aizawa swore he could see red, and not because of his quirk. Kid, Izuku, can you hear me? I'm right here, okay? I know you're hurting, but we're going to make it through this. I work better in silence, Eraserhead. Be a dear and stop blabbering. Before Aizawa could bite back with a retort, Izuku spoke up. His voice was hoarse and broken, barely above a whisper. The kid was sniffling, still biting back sobs. I'm fine, Zawa. And that absolutely tore Aizawa apart. To hear his kid mimic the words he himself had spoken just minutes ago, trying to conceal such horrible pain, was worse than any physical wound Aizawa could ever sustain. I believe I said. The doctor spoke from his position at Izuku's side, out of Aizawa's line of sight. Aizawa could hear something metallic clang, likely a tool being wielded by the doctor, before Izuku cried out in pain once more. I work better in silence. The room fell into a tense and anxiety-filled quiet, broken every few seconds by Izuku's muffled whimpers. Aizawa could barely breathe, his chest too tight, his heart pounding. He had no idea what was happening to his kid or how to help. All he knew was that Izuku was being hurt, and that the only things stopping him from beating the doctor senseless were the leather bands tying him down. Walking over to the side of the room farthest away from Aizawa, the doctor carried with him a medical bowl, placing it carefully on the cluttered countertop. He studied the bowl's contents for a moment before picking up a new set of tools. After what seemed like hours but was really only a matter of minutes, the man returned to Aizawa's side brandishing a familiar scalpel and metal bowl. And he repeated the process. Izuku writhed in his restraints, drifting in and out of unconsciousness. The doctor stood above him, scalpel in hand, lifting up Izuku's eyelid with his fingers as he. It was bright, white stark cold. Cut the connective tissue, the muscle, the nerves surrounding the fragile organ, digging his fingers into the socket and pulling. Screaming. Who was that screaming? He yanked it out. He yanked Izuku's eye, and it was in his hand and he could see it with the one he had left, could see the nerves dangling, still connected, and the doctor was grinning. He was laughing, and Izuku retched against the table, and the doctor reached back in to scrape something against the socket, and he was thrashing, screaming, sobbing because it hurt, it hurt, it hurt, it hurt, it hurt, it hurt. Izuku snapped awake, his mouth open in a silent scream, heaving frantically for breath. His whole body was shaking, hit with an ache that he didn't know what to do with. Everything felt charged somehow, as if his blood was made of static. Tears poured down his face, eyes stinging as he blinked at the harsh light beaming down, trying to remember where he was and what was happening. He blinked again. And again. The world around him seemed to slow down, if just for a moment. Izuku was blinking. Normally. Or semi-normally. His left eye, the one the doctor had taken, was not normal. At all. It felt weird, out of place, pulsing insistently with the beat of his heart. He didn't feel the emptiness he had felt previously, didn't feel the gaping spot of his eye socket exposed to open air. He could see out of both eyes. He reached up to touch it, wanting to see if it was real, if maybe everything was just a horrible nightmare, but couldn't move his arm. He was still in the doctor's office, still strapped to the observation table. But the doctor was gone, and the room was silent, aside from the sounds of his own breathing. Zawa? Are you here? Izuku's voice broke painfully, his throat raw from his screaming. No response. Panic pressed heavily on Izuku's chest, clawing away at his insides. He tried to think back, tried to remember what happened, what the doctor had done. The last thing he could remember was the doctor taking his eye. His left eye. Which was back now, for some reason. He remembered Aizawa calling out to him, asking if he was okay, and then, Izuku wasn't sure. He didn't know. It was harder to breathe now, thoughts of an injured, or worse, his brain whispered, Aizawa racing through his head. He struggled against his restraints, feeling for any sort of leeway but finding none. Eventually abandoning his efforts, Izuku relaxed slightly against the table, inhaling and exhaling deeply like Aizawa had taught him. In for 5 seconds, hold for 6, out for 7. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think. Izuku's biggest asset was his brain. It was time to use it. Quiet muttering filled the otherwise silent room as Izuku pieced together the day's events. He started with the things that he knew. He knew that he and Aizawa had been taken to the doctor's office together. He knew that Aizawa's quirk suppressor had been removed, and that the doctor had talked about Izuku's possibility of gaining a quirk, something about neural pathways in the cerebellum. He knew that the doctor had. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, his mumbling coming to an abrupt halt. He could feel the pain, the consuming sensation of pure, bone-chilling hysteria that took over his body at the sickening intrusion of the doctor's hand in his eye. Izuku grit his teeth together, trying to focus. Now wasn't the time to panic. He steadied his breath again before continuing. He knew that the doctor had removed his left eye. Izuku fought against the bile rising in his throat, pushing away the wave of intrusive thoughts. He knew that, for whatever reason, he had 2 eyes at the moment. He knew that he was in the doctor's office now, presumably having blacked out previously. He knew that he was alone. The thought brought tears to his eyes, which he quickly blinked away. Onto the things he didn't know. He didn't know where Aizawa or the doctor were located. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, or why he was still in the doctor's office, still strapped down. He didn't know how he got his eye back. A voice in his head whispered that he did know, that he never got his eye back, that it was a question of who and not how, but he pushed those thoughts down a stairwell in his brain and locked the door to keep them out. He didn't think he could handle that right now. He couldn't handle any of this right now. In the first few months of Izuku's capture, when he was terrified and utterly alone, he'd spend hours at a time revisiting old memories, trying to gain any semblance of warmth from the embers of his past. Sometimes it helped, and sometimes it didn't, but it was the only thing he could think of trying to get his mind off of, well, all of it. So he retreated to the safer places of his mind, away from the metal table he was strapped to, away from the cold, harsh light of the doctor's office. He forced himself to think about happier times, before he had been kidnapped. Before he had been diagnosed as quirkless. He thought of his mother. When he was little, she was always so warm. She'd play heroes with him and always was the villain, so that Izuku could be all might. They'd run around the house laughing, Izuku tripping over his own feet as he tried to catch up to her, cheeks hurting from smiling so hard. When he managed to reach her and demand that she go to jail peacefully, she'd do her best, scary voice that had Izuku biting back giggles, trying to act serious and hero-like. He remembered when, anytime he got sick, she would make katsudon and they would watch old hero movies on the couch together, pajamas donned and stuffed animals clutched tightly to their chests. Or her inquisitive eyes whenever he would talk about concepts few children were familiar with. The look on her face when he asked for a book about biochemical engineering for his birthday was priceless. And her hugs, she would envelop his whole body in her arms and rock him back and forth, humming softly to a tune only she knew. He didn't think of the blank look in her eyes that grew ever darker after his diagnosis. How, as he grew older, she seemed to always be gone working to pay for the house, for him, she would say. But the water was cold and the lights would shut off every few weeks, and he had to sell his hero merchandise to buy groceries when she didn't come home for days. No, he didn't think about that, couldn't think about that. He thought of Katsuki. Kaken. His mischievous smile, his scarlet eyes. The boy was always covered in dirt or mud, unable to stay clean whenever they played outside. Whenever he'd see something cool or funny, his head would whip around, looking for Zuka because look, it's a fuzzy caterpillar. They'd spend the day together, playing and reading and exploring, and at night they would stay awake under a carefully constructed pillow fort, talking about what kind of heroes they would be, what kind of costumes they would wear. Obviously one's colored blue, yellow, and red, just like All Might. They'd be strong, fast, kind, and together. They would do it together. They pinky promised, after all. He didn't think about the crackling of his palms, the look in his eyes when Bakugo found out that he was quirkless, when he realized it wasn't a joke. Izuku had never smelled burning skin before, had never even considered the type of marks that a quirk like Bakugo's would leave on human flesh. Bakugo was passionate and relentless qualities of a great hero. And in his world, Izuku was the villain. Because why else would he have told Izuku to take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in his next life? Izuku was ripped out of his memories by the sound of a door closing, the heavy metallic click echoing throughout the room. He hadn't realized he was crying until now. Footsteps could be heard approaching the table Izuku was strapped to, and the doctor's figure appeared in Izuku's peripheral vision. You're awake, good. It looks like the eye has taken to you nicely. Even the tear ducts are working. It was quite tricky to revert such tiny nerves back to a previous state, especially when trying to connect them with a foreign eye, but everything has gone precisely as planned. Rifling through his jacket pockets, the man pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on and shining it directly into Izuku's left eye. Izuku blinked at the sudden light, flinching at the doctor's uncomfortable closeness. After a second, the man clicked the light off with a satisfied hum. He pulled up a chair next to the table Izuku was on. Izuku's whole body tensed up, fear coursing through his veins like ice. Taking note of his terror, the doctor chuckled. Now, I'm not going to hurt you. No, these tests will be much less intrusive. Tell me, how does your eye feel? Izuku didn't respond. He just glared up at the ceiling, scared and angry and in pain. He wanted to be with Aizawa. He didn't care about the doctor and his stupid tests, didn't even care if the man hurt him for staying silent. He wished the man would shut up and leave. As if sensing Izuku's rising indignation, the doctor shifted tactics. I'm sure you're wondering where your dear hero is. After hearing those few words, Izuku's fear shriveled up and died, replaced with a fury that had him seeing red. What did you do with Aizawa? Izuku growled, his voice full of hatred. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. The doctor covered his surprise by shifting in the chair, clearing his throat quickly. Don't worry, my boy, the man is alive. Actually, he should be arriving any minute now. Along with company. The doctor grinned at that, amusement evident in his tone. It only made Izuku more resentful. He opened his mouth to spit out an insult when the door opened once more. Izuku couldn't see who walked in, but if he could, all of the blood would have drained from his face. In walked guard number 1, carrying a limp Aizawa in his arms, flanked by none other than Chisaki Kai. Izuku heard the doctor rise from his seat, the squeaking of the chair echoing in the quiet room. Welcome, welcome. Please, set him down there. His eyes widening, Izuku's heart rate picked up. Aizawa? Zawa, is that you? Are you okay? He pulled fruitlessly against his bindings, his cracking voice frantic as he called out for the man. No response. I swear if you hurt him I'll make you wish you were never born, Yubi. Izuku's outburst was cut off by a cold, eerie voice. A voice he was all too familiar with. What a filthy mouth you have. It seems the hero has corrupted you already. Shame. Izuku snapped his jaw shut so hard his teeth clanked together. A horrible blanket of cold, mind-numbing fear washed over him. It had been weeks, maybe even months, but Overhaul's voice was able to inspire terror in him as if he had just been ripped apart yesterday. He heard him click his tongue, humming approvingly. The sound made Izuku sick. And yet, like a dog, he can be trained. Good. Normally, Izuku would have been outraged by a comment like that. But all he could think about was what was going to happen next. Why they had Overhaul here of all places with Aizawa. Why they had experimented with their eyes. Why they had removed Aizawa's quirk suppressor. Dread seemed to tear apart his insides, while stinging the back of his throat. He just wanted to disappear. Yet some higher power seemed to love torturing Izuku, and so he regretfully remained right where he was. He could hear movement throughout the room, metallic clanging noises and the shuffling of bodies, but he couldn't actually see anything other than the ceiling. That was, until the doctor pressed a pedal with his foot, causing the operating table that Izuku was immobilized against to move. He didn't even know it could do that. Within seconds he was maneuvered into an upright position, finally able to see what was happening in the room. But the sights before him had Izuku wishing he could return to staring at the ceiling. Across the room from him, strapped to an identical metal table, was Aizawa. Normally Izuku would be relieved at being able to see him, but his fear only worsened at the man's appearance. He looked horrible. His pale skin shone in the harsh light, speckled with blood. Long, greasy hair framed his face, limp and tangled. Even unconscious, his brows were furrowed, his lips pulled taut. Deep bags lined his eyes. But the entire left side of Aizawa's face was covered in blood-stained bandages. Only his right eye was visible, seemingly untouched. Izuku wanted so badly to leap forward, to run and help him, hold him, to do something, but his hands were tied. Literally. Standing next to Aizawa was Overhaul himself, in all his Muppet glory. Still in the same green jacket and birdbeak mask, the man painted an intimidating figure. Izuku refused to meet his gaze, focusing instead on seeing if Aizawa had any other visible injuries, none that Izuku could see, which was good but worrying in its own right. After finishing up the adjustments to Izuku's chair, the doctor cleared his throat, ignoring the glare that Izuku sent his way. Now, my boy, I'm sure you've put 2 and 2 together by now. Today, we're going to be testing if the experiment was a success. I want you to activate erasure. Izuku's heart seemed to stop. The world around him blurred, fading in and out of his vision as he processed what the doctor had said. He knew that this was coming. He had avoided it and pretended that it was something different, but he knew. It just didn't make the reality any easier to accept, to actually hear from another person. Didn't make it any easier to bear the fact that Aizawa's eye was in his skull. And apparently, Part of his quirk? Izuku choked out a sob. He didn't want any of this. He never had wanted any of this. Distantly, the doctor sighed. I guess we'll have to do this the hard way then. You're familiar with Mr. Overhaul's quirk, of course. The question was cruel and pointed, meant to scare Izuku into SBMson. Izuku was ashamed to say that it was working. He looked up at Overhaul's silent form, flinching as golden eyes met his. He looked away quickly, wanting this to be over. Look, I don't know how, okay? I can't feel a quirk or anything and I don't have any experience with this, so I can't just use it that easily. Izuku's voice was shaking and cracking with every word. The static in his skin was back again, prickling uncomfortably, insistently. Overhaul narrowed his gaze, the room falling silent. Izuku watched with widening eyes as the man reached to unclasp his glove, tilting his head in Aizawa's direction. Wait, stop. I need time, or something, or we could wait for him to wake up to tell me how to use it. Izuku pleaded, desperately trying to get Overhaul to step away from Aizawa. He searched frantically inside of himself for any sign of a quirk, but couldn't feel anything, couldn't do anything. It didn't help that he was panicking, his heart pounding against his chest and his breathing too fast, far too fast. One by one, Overhaul pulled his fingers out of his glove, not breaking eye contact with Izuku. Crying at this point, heaving for air, Izuku's voice rose. Please, just don't hurt him, I can't. If you don't want him getting hurt, my boy, then activate the quirk. It's really that simple. The doctor's tone was monotonous, cruel. The panic rising in Izuku's chest was suffocating. I'm trying, it won't work. Please, I'm trying. Overhaul's glove was off now, his hand reaching towards Aizawa. Stop it, get away from him, stop. Izuku thrashed against the leather bindings, crying out in vain, just wanting everything to go away, go away, go away, go away, go away. Something inside Izuku snapped. The static feeling in his body overwhelmed him, flooding his senses and setting his nerves ablaze. Warmth surged through his entire being, filling him with a sense of strength, of power. He glared at Overhaul, who had his fingertips resting on Aizawa's forehead, and screamed. GOAWY. Overhaul snatched his hand away from Aizawa as if he had been burned, turning to stare at Izuku with eyes widened in shock. Because Izuku had erased his quirk. His eyes had turned a flaming crimson, locks of hair floating around his head as if gravity could not touch it. Izuku's teeth were clenched in anger, snarling at Overhaul. For just a moment, he swore that he saw a trace of fear in the man's eyes. But just as soon as it appeared, it was gone. Overhaul turned to the doctor, his face blank. Prepare the training facilities for today. Run the other tests and get him cleaned up. I'll be back tomorrow to experiment further. The doctor barely had time to nod before Overhaul was out the door, glove already back on his hand without a second glance in Izuku's direction. With the threat gone, Izuku blinked, and erasure was no longer active. His eyes stung horribly, like he had just been crying for hours, and his head was pounding with a vengeance, but the pure fear and desperation had quieted down with Overhaul's departure. Izuku let himself sag against his bindings. For now, Aizawa was safe. Slipping into a brief state of unconsciousness, Izuku missed when the doctor had a guard bring Aizawa back to the cell. He missed the subtle twitch of Aizawa's hand when he passed by the doctor's equipment table. He missed one of the doctor's scalpels disappearing underneath Aizawa's sleeve, completely unnoticed, with the grace and tact only an underground hero could possess. No, Izuku didn't see any of that. And neither did the doctor.